Mute பண்ணுங்க. আমি না বলি
Rachel.
Good morning, everyone. Can we just wait for a few more minutes as more participants are joining in? Okay, and it seems to be there seems to be some technical glitches due to the weather as well. So please have patience with us.
Hello, Father. Can you hear us?
Yeah. Hello.
Good morning, Father. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning. Sir Parjanno, can you hear us? Good morning. Sir, I think we are muted.
Oh, yes.
Yes, sir.
Am
Good
I
to see
audible
you.
now?
Yes, sir. Good to see you.
Yeah.
And
Good morning,
welcome.
Father George. Good morning, Peter
Good
sir.
morning. Good morning.
Good morning,
Good
Patricia
Good
ma'am.
to see you. Good morning. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
We have a lot of rain here in Siliguri, Parjanno, sir. How is Sonada there?
I am in Siliguri. I'm based in Siliguri. So it's raining continuously since yesterday night. Yeah, maybe because of the weather. The technical glitches are because of the weather, I think.
Yes, sir. Yes. Pratishtha ma'am, are you also here in Siliguri or in? Ma'am, you are muted.
Yes, I'm here in Siliguri. I came back long back ago.
Okay.
Let's wait for some more because more
No
people are
problem. No
joining
problem.
in.
Yes,
Sure,
maybe
sure, sure.
another
We
maybe
should wait.
5-7 minutes we can
5-7
proceed.
minutes, I think we should
Yes,
wait.
yes.
People are
Therefore,
joining
we
in.
are going into some informal pleasantries because we know
Yes.
Arjuna sir, father, and
Good to see you, Father, after a very long time.
Good. Thank you. Thank you. You are in Siliguri?
I'm in Siliguri. I'm located in
Okay.
Pradhan Nagar.
Ah, okay, 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 nice.
Father, this place seems to be none of your offices that I have seen.
My office, I went, there was no connection.
Okay. Two
Then
offices. Which office did you
two
go to,
office.
Father?
My boss's office, I went, no connection. And too much
Okay.
of rain, I didn't go to the new building as yet. No workers are there. Some workers come and make too much of a noise. So this is
Okay.
an old room of Father T.L. Joes, if you remember.
Oh, okay, okay, okay. So that's why I was wondering. This is not of any of your offices that I have
I'm so
been.
lucky that this is my third office.
Okay, okay. Okay.
Peter sir, I think
Yes,
Father
ma'am.
Principal, he hasn't joined yet. So I'd informed
Okay.
him.
I'm just let me check the list of the people around here.
No, he hasn't
Yes, Father
joined.
hasn't joined. Let me just. Sangam Bhai, are you there, Sangam?
Hello. Yes, sir.
Hi, Sangam. You can just message Father, no? A reminder.
Okay, okay, fine. Okay, sir.
Father
Okay,
Principal. Okay.
okay. Father George is here.
Yeah, he's the
Good
vice
morning, Father
principal.
George.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning, Father.
Good morning.
Morning, Father, morning.
Good morning, Father. I think Ariha Chakraborty is presenting. Kindly please stop presenting.
Anisha Pradhan, could you please stop presenting?
Peter, isn't there a possibility to keep something presented so others cannot present?
Father, I'm actually going through the setting. I can't find it. I've muted most of them.
Okay, okay, okay.
No, I mean, earlier on, Rachel ma'am had presented something, right, Father?
If that is kept on, probably others
That
cannot
was the,
come.
yes.
Yes.
Yeah,
And in the
okay, sir.
event that speaker is speaking already, the resource person, earlier on, what we did was just to avoid, we removed that presenter, whoever was trying to mistakenly present like this, and one could come back again. So I think Solution College is Pratishtha. So such people you can remove, so they will come back again after
I'm looking
they
for
are removed.
Arya. Yeah, now I'm getting it. Could you just give me a few minutes because I'm handling the entire thing?
Sure, sure, no problem.
Okay. Just a few more minutes then. I think then Father after that will begin with our session.
Sure.
What is holding back?
I think we're still waiting for Deepti ma'am and a few others to join in.
I think Deepti ma'am is having a lot of technical issues because I had just called her. So, there's a high chance of her not joining, but she's also preparing a YouTube for us so that she can deliver her, presentation through YouTube, a video recording, because she's staying in Kalimpong and there's a lot of technical issues out there. So I think, Father, we'll start because it's already 10 past 10.
Yeah, I was trying to slowly sneak in, thinking that you had already started at 10 o'clock.
No, yes, Father, that was the plan.
No
but
further
because-
explanation required. You can just continue.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. So, first of all, I would like to apologize for not staying with the time. So today's topic is it's quite interesting, as we are going through a worldwide pandemic. So the theme that we've selected for today's session. Special session is on COVID-19, experiential narratives, marginal voices amidst the pandemonium of our times. So keeping this theme, we've actually come forward to actually grabbing the attention of just not the academicians. The objective of this, coming up with this webinar was actually to, discuss issues which are very much relevant in our day-to-day activities. And before I proceed with today's session, I would like to thank our Father Principal, Father George Thatavil, our Father Vice Principal, Father George Champakithina, our resource person, Mr. Prajanya Sen, and our Dean, Sir Peter Lepcha, as well as our participants for today's session. So without any further ado, I'd request our Father Vice Principal, Father George Champakithina, to speak a few words as the opening note for this session, as well as lead us into this prayer, so that we can have a very interactive and a very successful session. So, Father Vice Principal.
Good morning to all. I hope I am audible. When we hear of marginal voices, my thoughts first went back to all our migrant laborers all over the country, what pandemic we had, and how many of them trying to get back to their own people, and governments trying to feed them, to look after them, many getting, some are not getting, and all the difficulties that they went through. And we also know of thousands of them walking miles and miles with children, with wives, husbands, sick people, ailing people, and some getting lost on the way. I think their voices are still very much sounding in our backgrounds as we are still in this pandemic. So I thought this morning, as we begin this, we call God our loving Father, our Creator, to bless all of us, to find a solution for all this, and to bring us to some sort of a serenity, peace. So I would invite all our participants, just for a while, in closed eyes, just for about 2 minutes, experiencing God's presence in our life. It is challenging, it is difficult when people are suffering, when people are dying, to know that there's a God. But we know that the whole world is in this difficult moment. The only way is to get back to the Creator, get back to the one who is the author of life, We ask Him to bless all of us, and the little effort that we make here to understand the world situation, the sociological reality that we are facing, and how to respond to the situation of this sort. We ask God to bless all of us, bless all the participants, and all those who are specially invited to be guest lecturers to enlighten all of us. That we are inspired, that we to learn to cope with the situation, to make our own life serene and peaceful, and to inspire other people by our words, by our life. We also pray for all those who are suffering, all those who are serving the suffering, doctors and nurses, that they may experience peace and serenity in these challenging moments. Heavenly Father, we ask you this in deep faith. Amen. Thank you very much, and over to the next person.
Thank you, Father, for the wonderful prayer. I now request our principal, Father Dr. George Thotathil, to kindly spare a few words as he's the keynote speaker for today's session. Father, up to you.
Thank you, Father Dr. Tambagatinal, for initiating today's program, and thank you, Pradishta, and the entire team of political science and sociology for putting together this event into which much thought and planning and preparation has gone. And I would like to place on record my thanks and appreciation for the faculty team to think through these issues, to reflect them along with their students, and also to make it as a public event of this nature. Thank you. Secondly, a warm welcome to the resource persons of the day from my part, to Parjanya, who is in a way no stranger to us. So Parjanya, warm welcome. And to Dipti, and both from neighboring institutions in a way, making this reflection on the COVID situation in a way localized, as true to the spirit of sociological reflection, as well as a contextually positioned political reflection. Having said that, I cannot but make a note on this almost punning of pandemic and pandemonium, which comes from two different linguistic or etymological sensibilities. Pandemonium we associate with something that is, let's say, jovial, and there's a pandemonium going on. To it refers as a kind of semi-celebratory undertone. And on the other side, pandemic coming from epidemic, and a pan experience of an epidemic related to a disease and its spread has got quite a different undertone, or rather a visible tone to it. At the same time, I guess as a sociology department and political science department thinking together, at what has emerged in the literary scene or in the media scene or in the whole experience of talking about the pandemic itself, there's such a diversity of perceptions and positioning and speech acts itself, which gives the leeway for bringing the notion of pandemonium into this pandemic. And I guess that kind of a nuancing of the reflection is what the title itself is in a way inviting us. And as Father Dr. George mentioned, these are therefore the marginal voices coming into these two realities. Now, having said that as my second or third note, since there's a difference between saying a few words and being asked to present a keynote, though that also came a little bit like an undertone of semi-invitation, I guess, calls for due acknowledgement of what a keynote actually refers to. So I guess I must put into perspective what, from my take on the pandemic, pandemonium, marginal voices that you are trying to bring to the consciousness of these listeners and participants. And any speech, any written word has no limit to its so-called receivers of that information, because once this goes on the YouTube, you might see someone listening to Dipti or Parjanya 1 week down the line and sending in a feedback. So there's a ripple effect of any text that we create, an oral text or a written text, or of the kind of a webinar that we are organizing on this platform. So how do we put these two things together, or how would I like to put these two things together? So my reflection of the COVID situation from where we are located, I would like to take with a reflection on the pain aspect of a disease, whether it be an injury, whether it be a fever, whether it be a flu, or whether it be this, we are told, this SARS version of this COVID virus is basically a kind of a fever, flu, but like dengue, like chikungunya, this to get, COVID attack means you are in a more dangerous situation, because there's no medicine unlike the others. For flu, for sure that this is going to be lasting at the most, okay, 7 days, or as the tradition says, 14 days or 2 weeks, whichever you can choose. Or to, we know even if we get viral fever or we get typhoid, we know the thing. Whereas here there's uncertainty built around it. It has various variants in it, and therefore the pain aspect of, the pain implicit in contracting the disease makes one get bogged down, affected in varying degrees, depending, we are told, on the fact of the age, that if you are young, then you have less to fear. If you are old, you have more to fear. If you have no medical history, you have less to fear. If you have already, in a medical condition, then you have, more to be anxious about. So the variance of this disease impacting the one who receives, one who is contracted, one who, therefore, the entire neighborhood is under lockdown, so which affects the entire other events that would have happened normally. So there's a whole realm of the pain and associated with the disease. Now, one could say that the way the pain is going to affect you is going to affect you whether you are living in a five-star hotel or you are living in a jopdi. So in that sense, there is this whole discourse that this has neutralized or brought up everyone onto the same boat. Because if you get it, you have no guarantee as long as there is no medicine. Even if you have the money or the resource to take you anywhere, nowhere to go. For other illness, there's a heart surgery and that can be done by this particular doctor in this particular specialty, super specialty hospital, etc. So here there is no guarantee of that nature. And therefore, in that way, it has flattened the impact of this pain on everyone. Then we could look at, rather, it made me take to, how do we handle pain? Now, how do we handle pain, knowing that there are various ways in which we are forced into experiencing pain. You walk and you slip and you fall, or you hit against your table as you're trying to get up, and that knee keeps paining. And those, now I have with me here the January 2020 edition of the National Geographic, and the entire theme is on pain. So I was going through it as I was preparing something for this and our own journal, special issue that is coming out. And, I just want to read out to you something that this researched article by uh, Udijit Bhattacharya, writing for Time, after having, done a massive research for National Geographic. A lot of research, it says pain, it turns out, is a complex subjective phenomenon that is shaped by the particular brain that's experiencing it. How pain signals are ultimately translated into painful sensations can be influenced by a person's emotional state. Unquote. So pain is something very physical. We have, and they have even identified, we know we have the neurons, we have the synapses. So from the fingertip, you put your finger by chance onto a burning matchstick and you feel that pain because it has traveled from there through those, the neurons and the synapses communicating that message all the way up to your brain. And therefore you begin to feel the pain. So they have what is known as nociceptors. Those receptors or these nerve endings that are particularly attuned towards perceiving the pain. So, and these have been now with the medical stem cell research, they have grown those type of cells and these kind of neurons or nociceptors, and they are experimenting with rats to see, and so to give one example, so there are people who apparently had an injury was treated, but the pain is lasting, pain doesn't go away. So earlier, the doctors would say, but you are healed, where is the pain? So they would even, in a way, discount the pain of the client or the patient by saying you are concocting it, kind of thing. But now the research says that pain can be considered as a disease because there is the possibility, and it is true, there are 50 million people, by the way, in chronic pain situation in the US alone who are being tracked. And there are over 250 million people with pain across the present population. Those who have no reason but to, those who have very sensitive kind of nociceptors for their experience. So, I mean, I could go on and this article, you can read it yourself. A whole lot of research with regard to the, so my attention is, one direction is this kind of medical, physiological, brain-related assessment of the pain, and therefore the medication as a result, whether it is a vaccine for COVID or each of for these kind of drugs, etc., that will at least alleviate your pain so you are able to sleep. Of course, pain and talking of pain and sleep, you may suffer pain because you are feeling sleepy right now and you want to keep awake. That's a kind of discomfort. On the other side, you may be wanting to sleep at night and you are not able to sleep. And that's another type of pain, of the discontent. The final point or the latter part of my discussion is, while one could take pain and its study, disease and its impact in the physiological, biological, medical, bodily sense of it and how it is impacting on oneself, there's a whole other realm of dealing with pain which is coming from the meditative traditions. So if you do Vipassana, it is actually inviting you not to have a cushy time of, like a armchair philosopher or a meditator sitting lying down on your couch and enjoying your meditation days of 10 days. No, it's 10 days of going through intense experience of pain. Why? Because you sit 10 hours a day. First day for a few hours you might enjoy it. After that, next time you don't even feel like going back to that hall where everyone is walking to sit. Why? Because you know what you're going to experience. Your knuckles begin to break. So now the Vipassana is trying to tell you, you observe that pain. You observe what is the transition of that pain, where is the pain started, and where are you experiencing it in your brain. It is both an emotional state and a physical state. What are the connections in the framework of your experience? So just like the scientist is experimenting with pain, in the laboratory, the meditator is sitting and experimenting with and looking into one's own consciousness to understand how far can I cope with pain. How far can I live with it? And what happens is, a time comes when you, in a very neutral manner, observe this pain, the pain also disappears. Mind you, my dear friend, this I am not talking from the medical research data. This I am just culling out from my own self experience, my personal experience of having gone through. So my title is, the pain as a door to self-realization, pain as a door to self-transcendence, pain as the door or access point to transcending your own immediate difficulties. Now let me come to something more practical. Having said these two ways in which you could explore, saying to students and to faculty and all of us going through this stressful time, do not panic. Observe the intensity of the stress, distress, anxiety, including the physical discomfort and pain that you are experiencing. And without, you have the option to go and take a pill and to, solve your problem, or you have the possibility of daring to look at what it is that you are experiencing. And finally, my dear friends, when we do an intellectual activity of this nature, we are bringing brains and minds together. We are bringing our consciousness together, all of us listening to one another. And this very act of listening and sharing of our reflections is a process by which we are also responding and creating our own narratives, whether marginal or central, that is determined for someone in future to discourse about this event itself. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you, Father, for acknowledging us with such a very pragmatic approach to understanding pandemic as well, not only from an intellectual point of view, but also from a very psychological point of view as well. So without delaying any further, I would like to invite a resource person for today's session, Mr. Prajanya Sen. A little bit of introductory remark is required for Mr. Prajanya Sen. Mr. Prajanya Sen has submitted his PhD thesis at the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta, for the award of the degree of Doctor of Philosophy of Arts at Jadavpur University. He is currently working in Darjeeling and Sonada Degree College. He's worked under Professor Tapati Guha Thakurta on the cultural geography of Buddhism and the Buddhist revival movement in Eastern India and Bengal in the late 19th and 20th century. He's also an active participant in various national and international conferences and workshops, along with other various publications, and was also the Nehru Trust Visiting Fellow for the Indian Collections of the Victoria and Albert Museum, London, 2014 and 15. So I welcome Mr. Prajanya Sen to the platform. If you just give me a few seconds, Mr. Sen, let me just Mr. Prajanya, can you hear me? Mr. Prajanya?
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, let me just share you in the screen.
Sure.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Prajanya. You may take the platform.
Thank you so much. Firstly, let me thank Malaysian College. Let me thank the Department of Sociology and Department of Political Science for inviting me to talk, to share a few, to talk today. And thank you so much, Father George, Pratishtha ma'am, everyone here, and a very good morning to everyone who might be listening. When Father George was speaking about pain and our experiences of pain, I was reminded of a deeply personal loss. I mean, we have been dealing with this situation, this pandemic, for the past 3 or 4 months, and I have lost 2 people who were very close to me to the virus, Professor Hari Vasudevan, who was a retired professor of history at Calcutta University, and Bhikkhu Bodhipal, who was the head Bhante or head monk of the Bengal Buddhist Association. So we each of us have different ways of processing and dealing with pain, whether it is physical pain or emotional pain. So thank you, Father. I mean, I really began reflecting on what you said about the experience of pain. That said, I would like to talk today on COVID-19 and the experiential narratives of racism. And I have divided this talk into two parts. In the first part, I'll be focusing on understanding racism in the Indian context. Since today's topic is on the pandemic and marginalized voices, it is important for us to understand what the import of racism is in the Indian context before we move more specifically to understanding COVID-19 and its effects on racism in particular. So I divided this talk into two parts. The first part I have called Understanding Racism in the Indian Context. And I would like to begin with a quote from the Racism Reader. It was published in 2003, edited by Robert Miles and Malcolm Brown. They write, and I'm quoting, "Racism postulates the existence of discrete races and attributes a negative evaluation to one or some of these putative races, usually, though not always, the race or races to which the person articulating the racist ideology does not regard himself or herself as belonging. In this sense, racism is produced ideologically and discursively." Now, this is the crucial point that both Miles and Brown are trying to get at, that racism is produced ideologically and discursively. Of course, Miles and Brown are mainly talking about the European context, the American context, the Western context, but we need to appropriate this into the Indian context, into our understanding of what racism means in India. So when we say racism is produced ideologically and discursively, and then when we look at the context of India, we can say that the Northeast, the states of the Northeast, they are produced both ideologically and discursively as the other of mainstream India. Okay, I would like to reiterate this. The Northeast, the cluster of Northeastern states, they're linguistically, ethnically, religion, in terms of culture, culturally, in the sense of religion, they're very, very diverse. At the same time, they begin to be produced as a cluster, as one. They're produced ideologically and discursively as, I quote, unquote, the other of mainstream India. In the Northeastern states, as I have already mentioned, despite their linguistic, ethnic, religious, and cultural diversity, it's produced discursively as one, primarily through a nationalist mainstream Indian paradigm. It becomes the other, the exoticized and vulgarized other, and it is thus disseminated within mainstream Indian imagination and cultural production. Now, what am I trying to get at here? I'm trying to say that for us who live in a place like Siliguri, who live in inhabit a cosmopolitan culture in Siliguri or in Darjeeling, we would be aware of this. But say for someone inhabiting a metro city like a Delhi or a Bangalore or a Calcutta, the entire group of Northeastern states, I mean, people cannot often distinguish between a Nagaland or a Mizoram or a Sikkim, though these are ethnically and religiously and culturally as diverse, it needs to be produced ideologically and discursively as one, and it is defined in opposition to the mainstream Indian subcontinent. Okay. Myers and Brown argue that in the Western context, racism has its roots within European expansionism, colonialism, and the Judeo-Christian cultural paradigm. In the context of mainstream India, however, racism as a phenomenon becomes rooted within a Brahminical, heteropatriarchal imagination of the nation state. In this context, it may very well be argued that racism is intrinsically linked to the nationalist project and the formation of a nationalist imaginary. In the Indian context, of course, let me explain this. When we're looking at the European context, and we're looking at racism in a European context, we may say that it is the product of European policies of expansionism, it is the product of colonialism, it is the product of a Judeo-Christian cultural paradigm. But in the Indian context, racism has its roots within a Brahminical imagination, nationalist imagination or framing of the nation state, whereby the Indian self is produced, the main Indian self produced discursively pitted against its racial or ethnic other, which is the Northeast. Okay, that's what I'm trying to get at. As Myers and Brown write, I'm quoting from Myers and Brown, by attributing a population with certain characteristics in order to categorize and differentiate it as an other, those doing so establish criteria by which they themselves are represented. So what are we doing? By categorizing and differentiating the other, we are in turn framing our notion of ourselves. And of course, in an European context, this is related to European policies of expansionism throughout the 18th and the 19th century, colonialism, a Judeo-Christian cultural paradigm. However, in the Indian context, we must read it as part of a Brahminical imagination of the nation state and the framing of the Northeast as the cultural other. In the European context, Africans were described as black and savages, thereby framing a self-representation of Judeo-Christian European culture as white and civilized. In the context of mainstream India, this form of ideological defining of the self in opposition to an ethnic, linguistic, and cultural other manifests itself vis-a-vis certain cultural markers. Okay, now I would dwell a little bit upon this point. I'm still not come to COVID-19. I'll be talking about that in the second section of this presentation. What do I mean when I say ideological defining of the self in opposition to an ethnic, linguistic, and cultural other manifests itself vis-a-vis certain cultural markers? For instance, food. Now, a lot of us may be familiar with the Netflix film. I mean, a lot of us have been sitting at home, amidst our online classes and various other duties which we have been sort of discharging online virtually. We have also been, hooked to the TV and to these virtual platforms like Netflix and Amazon Prime. And a movie directed by Nicholas Khargonkar, it's called Ahuni. It's a 2020 film. I would like to refer to it. The movie is about a group of kids. They're a group of college-going kids, and they live in Delhi, suburbs. So the foul stench, the foul smell that the food gives. So, they move from their rented place, move from one place to another, then from that place to another. And, the whole movie then becomes this whole exercise, this process of cooking one's own delicacy. So, whenever I say that this cultural framing of the other manifests itself vis-a-vis certain cultural markers, food becomes a very important cultural marker. They eat food that we don't. This is exactly how mainstream India constructs and frames its own imagination of itself. Okay, they eat something that we don't. Their food is not good food. So this means that our food is good food. So this us and them binary opposition. This is how we frame our own of ourselves, the imagination that we have of ourselves by defining us against the other, vis-a-vis the other. And food becomes a very important cultural marker. So that's why I wanted to refer to this film called Ahuni. Okay. I would like to also refer to another book, this once again a reader, Theories of Race and Racism, a reader. It's edited by Les Black and John Solomon. It was published in 2000 by Routledge, New York. And I would like to, it's an anthology, it's a collection of essays. And there is a very interesting essay here by Slavoj Zizek. The essay is called Enjoy Your Nation as Yourself. And I will quote Zizek here because this is an important historical framework in order to understand racism in the Indian context. I'm quoting Zizek. The national cause is ultimately nothing but the way subjects of a given ethnic community organize their enjoyment through national myths. We always impute to the other an excessive enjoyment. She or he wants to see our enjoyment by ruining our way of life, and or she or he has access to some secret perverse enjoyment. Unquote. Now we know that mainstream India loves imagining northeastern girls as hypersexualized, easily available, and therefore as a commodity, as an object, as a commodity. So we have to understand this. Given Zizek's theoretical framework, I once again would like to reiterate this particular part of it, the quote. She or he wants to steal our enjoyment by ruining our way of life, and or she or he has access to some secret perverse enjoyment. Now I remember an auto ride in Siliguri itself. This happened about a month back when I was coming in an auto, and I was having a conversation with the auto driver rather. He was a Bengali, and he was telling me, of course, smoking is injurious to health for all of us. I'm not advocating smoking here at all. I'm just using this as an ethnographic instance. So this auto driver started telling me, Dada, Bhaiya, you know, these days we see the Bengali girls of Siliguri, they have started smoking and they have learned this from the Nepali girls. Okay, this is exactly how such a framework works. You know, we tend to associate this idea of a secret perverse enjoyment with the other. Okay, and this is how we end up defining our own self. Okay, and the same auto driver went on to reiterate a lot of very objectionable comments and remarks about Nepali women. And this is exactly how the us-them binary opposition begins to percolate and begins to operate within our imagination of ourselves. Okay. In this context, the girls from the Northeast are imagined as hypersexualized, easily available, and therefore they become a commodity of consumption and become the object of such, I quote, Zizek, secret perverse enjoyment. Okay. At the same time, using a model of the chaste, pure Brahminical woman as wife. Okay. So there is an opposition here within this Brahminical and nationalist imagination of the Indian nation state. There is the chaste, pure Sati Savitri wife figure, and there is its binary opposition, the binary opposite, the hypersexualized Northeastern girls. Okay. The cigarette smoking, so-called cigarette smoking, hypersexualized, bad Northeastern other. Okay, and this is how the self, the Sati Savitri, chaste lady, begins to be defined. And this is exactly how racism operates. You know, it is structurally framed, it is ideologically constructed, it is discursively constructed, and it becomes a part of this very nationalist project. Okay, that's what I'm trying to get at. Ketan Bhatt, in his essay, The Lore of the Homeland, Hindu Nationalism and Indigenous Neo-Racism, this is also part of the same anthology, Theories of Race and Racism are Reader. The essay is called, once again, The Lore of the Homeland, Hindu Nationalism and Indigenous Neo-Racism. Ketan Bhatt, I quote him, the Hindutva movement condenses numerous themes around ethnogenesis, religious authoritarianism, cultural absolutism, the nature of secular post-colonial citizenship, majority-minority relations, and racial and ethnic hatred that often appears separately in other examples of contemporary religious and ethnic conflict. Okay, I would like to reiterate this quote once again. The Hindutva movement condenses numerous themes around ethnogenesis, religious authoritarianism, cultural absolutism, the nature of secular post-colonial citizenship, majority-minority relations, and racial and ethnic hatred that often appear separately in other examples of contemporary religious and ethnic conflict. Unquote. Now, I would like to refer to an example, an instance from 2014. It made the headlines all over, where Nidu Taniam, a 19-year-old guy from Arunachal Pradesh, he was the son of a Congress MLA from Arunachal Pradesh. He was brutally murdered in the Lajpat Nagar area of Delhi on January 29, 2014. And the fact that he was the son of a Congress MLA didn't help him at all. You know, it was an incident where a group of men started commenting on his clothes and on his hairstyle. And the moment he objected, the moment he sort of protested against that, there a fight broke out, and he became the target of a brutal racist violence. Okay, and eventually he succumbed to his injuries and he died the very next day. So the news shocked the nation, but as we know, such news is not new to any of us. You know, we keep reading about instances of racism, particularly from the national capital, from Bangalore, from Calcutta, from different other metro cities. And we need to understand this in the context of what Chetan Bhatt is trying to say, that our own framing of this Hindutva ideology, it begins to define itself around this ethnogenesis, around this cultural absolutism and this positioning of the majority-minority relation. Okay, that's why I refer to the Hindu-Samian case, and I talked about it. Okay? So that is the first part of this lecture, first part of this talk, where I have tried to understand how racism is framed and constructed ideologically and discursively in the Indian context, in the mainstream Indian context. Now I move to the second part of the talk. I call it COVID-19 and the exceptional nature of racism. Okay. Till now I have not even talked about COVID-19 at all. So I think we needed to first understand how racism itself is discursively and ideologically constructed in the case of mainstream India, how the Northeast is framed as ideologically framed, discursively framed as the racial other of mainstream India. And we have also looked at some of the theoreticians writing on this. So I move to the second part of this lecture, COVID-19 and the exceptional nature of racism. I will refer to two ethnographic instances. On March 24, 2020, the present government nationwide lockdown from March 25 for we're all aware of this. The government and the government ordered a nationwide lockdown from March 25 to 2020. This was extended this was subsequently extended. It lasted 4 phases till May 25, 2020, followed by 3 phases. The third is presently in force of unlock. Okay. On the same day, that is March 24, 2020, the Indian Express reported that in northwestern Delhi, a man passed huge comments at a 25-year-old Manipuri woman. When the man objected, the man spat at her, called her Corona, and ran away. Okay, this is another instance I would like to purchase. Another instance. Various incidents of racist aggression, both verbal as well as physical, against individuals from India's northeast were reported from various parts of the country. For example, news from Nagaland, including 6 women and 3 men, were forcibly quarantined. Despite showing no symptoms of the virus and having had no history of foreign travel or contact with any COVID-19 patients. They were simply forced into isolation on the random complaint that these 9 young women and men could be carrying the virus because they looked Chinese. Okay, so I would like to formulate 2 discursive categories here in the Indian context. One and what I call exceptional racism. Everyday racism we already talked about in the previous section of this lecture. Okay. Now I would like to talk about what I call as exceptional racism. Exceptional racism, as I see it, as I read it, this is my term, I'm using the term, then needs to be understood as a situation of exception as far as leveling fissures within Dominican nationalist self and its northeastern ethnocultural other legitimizes itself by playing upon or acting upon these very fissures. Now, what am I trying to get at here? I've already discussed how the mainstream Indian Dominican nationalist self-imaginary works by pitting itself against in opposition to its northeastern other. Okay, I talked about the cultural markers and all of that. Now I'm talking about how the situation of exceptional racism. Okay, I don't think, on one hand, when you look at the pandemic, when you look at the virus as a leveler, okay, but at the same time, I do not read it as a leveler. Why? Because Far from leveling the existing fissures, it widens these fissures. It plays upon these fissures, which are already existent within such nationalist imaginary. It legitimizes itself by drawing upon, by playing upon these very fissures of the self and the other. In this context, the virus as a quote-unquote Chinese virus becomes pertinent, particularly as the present BJP government's failure to handle the pandemic crisis became diverted onto a nationalist projection of Indo-Chinese rivalry. And we have been reading all about the Ladakh border dispute, the Kargil dispute, the Lipulekh dispute, aggravated tensions between India and China. What am I trying to get at here is that the BJP government, the central government's absolute incompetence and failure in order to control the pandemic then becomes projected upon a xenophobic projection, xenophobic nationalist projection of an Indo-Chinese aggression. Now, what happens as a result of this? Within the nation state, this becomes mapped upon those individuals who begin to be rendered as scapegoats and easy stand-ins for the Chinese. That is, people from the northeastern states. They become stand-ins, figuratively, metonymically, substitutively, they become stand-ins for the Chinese. Already discursively and ideologically rendered as the racial other, it becomes all too easy, projecting this heteropatriarchal, Brahminical, nationalist angst against this racial other, who somehow becomes the metonym or the substitute of a China or a Chinese. Okay, that is exactly what is happening now. That is exactly how I read the present instance of racism. I have talked about two instances of the Manipuri lady being spat at and of the 6 of the 12 individuals being detained without any, they were not carrying the virus in any way. They were not, they hadn't even come into contact with anyone, any COVID-19 patients. They were just, put into isolation because they looked Chinese. Now, all this is happening because the government is trying, it's playing on, the present government plays on this Brahminical nationalist Hindu imagination of the nation state, right? And it's trying to then project this upon a sort of xenophobic projection of this as Indo-China tension. And who becomes the easy target, the metonym of this within the nation state? It is the people from the northeast, simply because, quote unquote, they look Chinese to the Indian imagination, to the Indian framework. Okay? This is what I read as an instance of exceptional racism. It's my word, my moorings within on the pandemic brought on by the quote-unquote Chinese virus. Okay. 2020, I would like to refer to a book. It's edited by Ronobi Shomadar. It's published by Mohanirban Calcutta Research Group, and the book is called Borders of an Epidemic, COVID-19 and the Migrant Worker. I think it was Father George who was talking about the problems faced by migrant workers, and that's what this book is all about. But it also briefly touches upon, Ronobi Shomadar touches upon this idea of racism. He just talks about it, but not in detail because his focus is the migrant worker community. So I would quote from the introduction of this book. It's also an edited anthology published in 2020. I quote, "The only way out for liberal politics, it seems, is to create racist and xenophobic responses to the crisis, blame others to hide its own systemic incompetence. This response is neo-Malthusian in essence. People are victims of a neo-Malthusian game." So what is he trying to say? One second, I reiterate, I re-quote, "The only way out for liberal politics," and this applies as much to America as it does to India in very different sort of context. Because America, some kept on reiterating Chinese virus, okay? And the same thing, is happening on a different cultural level in India as well. Where, of course, you call it a Chinese virus and then you make the people from the northeastern states the scapegoats, okay? The only way out for liberal politics, it seems, is to create racist and xenophobic responses to the crisis, because that is the only way you can hide your own systemic incompetence. This response is neo-Malthusian in essence. People are victims of a neo-Malthusian game. Okay. So what is Malthusian? We might have heard about the term. Malthusian is the idea that population growth is potentially exponential while the growth of the food supply or other resources is linear. It draws upon Reverend Thomas Robert Malthus from his essay on the principle of population published in 1798. And what does the term neo-Malthusian mean? It's the advocacy of human population planning to ensure resources and environmental integrities for current and future human populations as well as our cities. So this is the way in which neoliberal or liberal policies or liberal politics, function. They frame the only way they can hide their own systemic incompetence is by creating these xenophobic and these racist categories and then projecting it upon the other. As conclusion, I would like to dwell on how this exceptional nature of the pandemic has created the discursive framework of an exceptional racism. I reiterate, the exceptional nature of this pandemic has created the discursive framework of an exceptional racism, one that seeks its legitimacy both through everyday racism as well as through the very exceptional nature of the pandemic. So this kind of exceptional racism, it's my coinage, it seeks its legitimacy both through everyday racism as well as through the very exceptional nature of this COVID-19 pandemic. It locates itself firmly within an already established nationalist and xenophobic axis and maps itself unto and upon the northeastern ethnic and cultural other. Far from leveling the fissures within a nationalist construction of the mainstream Indian self, it widens these fissures, plays upon these fissures, and derives its very legitimacy from these fissures. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Prajan Sen, for a wonderful talk on racism. I totally understand that this present topic which you dealt with is a matter about recent phenomena and gathering factual factors is a matter about, it's a challenge as well. So, Mr. Sen, and we've got a few questions from the audience for you. I think it's from Chiring Dolka. This particular question, excuse me, could you please, some of you turn on your audios, could you please turn it off? Okay. So, Mr. Sen, this question, I know it's a bit different. It doesn't, really go with the topic, and but for the sake of the person, the person is asking, does drinking lots of water help flush out COVID-19? So, whoever had posted this question, Chiring Dorkal, I would, if you don't mind, Mr. Sen, I'd like to say that, this topic is more, the platform is more about dealing with the social phenomena, rather than the biological concept. So I think the question might just be inappropriate, because we are not, into biological factors. So we are dealing more with the social or the psychological phenomena out here. So if you don't mind, I think we are in no position to give you the answer to this question. So moving ahead, this question is asked by one of our faculty members, Sangam Ghatani, from Political Science Department. So his question is, so do you see a parallel between racism and identity movements, particularly in the Northeast region? So was my voice audible, sir?
Yeah. See, the way I read it, indigenous identity movements are, particularly when they are located in the various they come from the various states of the Northeast. And for me, I would like to tell it out very clearly that for me, the Northeast cannot be one, because I've already mentioned this in my talk, that the Northeast is culturally, religiously, ethnically very, very diverse. A person, an individual from Sikkim is as different as possible from an individual from another land, in my reading. So I would like to say that identity, self-construction of an identity, it is a very, very important response to racism. It can be seen as a counter to racism. That is why, I may not even be the right person to talk about it, because I am only talking about it as I am seeing it. But perhaps a person, anyone from any state of the Northeast, would be in a far better position. It would be wrong of me, it would be too presumptuous of me to step into someone's shoes and talk about their experiences. Okay, but as I see it from the perspective of the outsider, from the perspective of a social scientist, I think indigenous identity politics are very, very necessary, and they can be an ideal counter to the mainstream Indian racist framework, where the entire Northeast is discursively and ideologically constructed as the other of mainstream India through their food habits, through whatever they wear, through their hair, through everything, They're constructed as this ethnic, this cultural other of this dominical nationalist self that is mainstream India. So I think indigenous identity politics, indigenous identity self-construction becomes very, very important. And that is where we need, say, a Mizo or a Mizo individual or a Tamang individual or a Lepcha individual, all of them to come and talk about their individual identities and how these identities, what these identities mean to them. And it is important to foreground these identities and sort of throw it back on mainstream India's feet. I think that's it. These kind of identity politics are very, very identity movements rather. Self-construction is very, very important, and they can serve as a very important response counter to mainstream India's racism. That would be my answer.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Sen. We've got another question. I think the answer to this question might just be similar to what you were stating, but for the sake of the person who has stated the question, the person asks, in the Indian context, racism is faced by any group which is a minority. The use of the term Madise for mainland Indians in the Darjeeling Hills and Sikkim in-line example, which you may have come across. Similar examples are present everywhere in Northeast too. Therefore, can we say that construction of the culturally other is done everywhere, and it's more about the dominant group trying to create the idea of the other? I'm not denying that people from Northeast India face discrimination. So if you could not get the question, you may go through the chat box as well. It's by Kalpana.
I completely understand what Kalpana Prasad is trying to get at here. But you see, while it is, of course, there are subnationalisms at work. So whether there is a Naga subnationalism, there have been movements for, Naga subnationalism and all that. There are subnationalisms at work. There are regionalisms at work. But at the same time, I do not think labeling someone or calling someone, creating names or categories is not the same as discursively and ideologically and violently and brutally creating a framework of self-definition. Look at the case of Mesothelioma, for instance, and that is not the only case. Look at the case of the Manipuri woman, for instance, who was called Corona and who was spat at. Look at the case of the mass exodus of students from the Northeast, from Bangalore, who were, I think it happened a few years ago, where they were so scared that they were boarding trains and coming back, rushing back to their home state. Have you ever seen a similar situation happen to Madhesi people, quote-unquote Madhesi people, in any part of the Northeast? So we have to understand that, of course, naming and category. I mean, even in the Bengali Bhadralok culture where I grew up in Calcutta, we had terms. We had terms for Biharis. We had terms for very deplorable and very disgusting terms, but we had terms for Tamilians. So labeling and naming might be a different process, but violently constructing a sort of nationalist self-imagery by creating a racial other. So we are trying to understand it from a discursive point here. And when we are talking about instances of racism, we are talking about violent and brutal repercussions, which we are reading about every day in the newspaper. So yes, I would not deny that there are, there are examples, there are instances of subnationalism, of regionalism, but I seriously doubt whether these take the scale and the sort of proportion of the amount of bullying, the amount of ragging, and the amount of violence, both verbal as well as physical, that any individual from any part of the Northeast has to every day live with and negotiate with in the metro cities. So that would be my answer.
So we've got a few other questions as well. This is by Ravi Mishra. So the person is asking, why are outbreaks often connected with racism?
Why are?
Outbreaks often connected with racism.
Oh, I'm not very sure I understand what the
Maybe
question
the
means
person
by
is
the
trying to say
outbreak.
like outbreaks, like if I'm not wrong, I would like to explain this question. Maybe the person is trying to ask you as to why, speaking about the Indian phenomena, we've got so many cases, communal violence or any sort of violence as well. But why is it that most of the violence which happen in India are usually connected or gets connected with racism? If you see the cases of a few years back, Momo, they had literally banned Momo in let's say in Delhi, which was very, very much famous. But again, this cultural, the food culturally associated with, again leads to another concept of targeting the Mongolians, or whom they call as the Chinky. So maybe the person is trying to say, why is it usually always have to be connected with racism? Why is it that always they are targeting the minority?
I think, as I already mentioned, because that is how the mainstream Indian imaginary, self-imaginary works, by defining itself against what it sees as its cultural other. And for the mainstream Indian, as I said, they would never be able to distinguish between Nagaland or a Sikkim, which are culturally and religiously and ethnically very, very diverse. For them, anybody who does not resemble them, so it's just us them binary. So they frame their own nationalist self, nationalist imagination of their self, by defining it, pitting it against this cultural other. And once again, I would also like to just briefly dwell upon this whole corona pandemic. I think far from because this pandemic brought out the worst in us, if I might say. People became phobic of people. People just see someone from the northeast who happens to live in Bangalore and who happened to just be hunting for a house, and the lockdown started. How much more difficult would it be someone from a Nagaland or a Mizoram or a Sikkim or Arunachal Pradesh to get accommodation in a place like Bangalore? Think about it. We would immediately be called Chinese, labeled Corona, and not be given a flat to stay. So they could not return home because of the lockdown, neither could they find a place to live in. So far from being a leveler, far from making people equal, I think the coronavirus pandemic, it brought out, it played upon these fissures, it played upon these existing fissures which were already existent in mainstream Indian society, and further widened these fissures. So that is what I mean when I say exceptional nature of the pandemic. It played upon these fissures and it widened these fissures.
Okay, thank you, sir. We've got one last question for you. It's from Natasha Guru. She wants to ask, out of curiosity, I wanted to know why all sorts of crimes happen in New Delhi, or is it the media don't flash out the crimes of other metropolitan cities?
That is a very tricky question. I would not say that racism is limited to New Delhi, definitely not. I mean, racism is as pertinent in Calcutta as it is in Bangalore, as it is in New Delhi. Perhaps because, New Delhi, my own sort of understanding of it would be because New Delhi doesn't have any indigenous population of its own. It's got a floating population. It's got a floating group of people, none of whom are really from Delhi. They all come there to work. And because it's the national capital, that's only too obvious. So you have Jats, you have Biharis, you have Marwaris, you have Bengalis, you have Nagamis, you have Assamese, you have Sikkimis. All kinds of people, they come to the national capital for work. New Delhi hardly has any resident indigenous population of its own, unlike, say, the case with Calcutta or Bombay. You hear fewer instances of racism from Bombay or Calcutta, perhaps because they have an already existing certain indigenous cultures. Okay, New Delhi, it has a very floating sort of culture, and also New Delhi has a very strongly masculinized framing construction of itself. This Jat masculine construction, Jat construction of New Delhi masculinity, New Delhi identity. It's very Jat, very Punjabi in that sense. Sorry if I'm sort of using these frameworks. Perhaps that is the reason why then the people from the northeast are very easily, they become the vulnerable other, the vulnerable ethnic other upon whom instances of racism upon whom instances of racism can be easily perpetrated. But by no means is racism restricted to the national capitals. Of course not. It is a very, very pertinent issue in all the metro cities, in all the cities of India.
Okay, we've got a few more questions are coming up. This is from Shitish Tamong. He states, India being a youthful nation, where around 65% of a population is comprised of people below 35 years of age. What are the steps that can be taken to incorporate the racially marginalized section into mainstream society?
That is a very, very pertinent question. Thank you so much for raising it. I was actually waiting for a question like this. I think one very, very important way is incorporate the diverse histories and cultures of the Northeast as part of school textbooks. I mean, we have all grown up studying in ICSE and CBSE board schools, or even state board schools. How much do we actually know of a Nagaland or a Mizoram or an Arunachal Pradesh or a Sikkim? We just know that, they geographically they exist at some part of the Indian continent. When we have separate chapters, or maybe just say a class 6 or a class 7 textbook or a class 8 textbook can have a big, huge chapter dealing with each of the states of the Northeast, the diverse groups of people. Say Arunachal Pradesh as a state has the most number of indigenous communities, and we hardly know about any of them. So by incorporating them within the mainstream school curriculum, that can be one strong way of making children, because as children we are learning, right? So I think it's important that really from an early age we are made aware of this ethnic diversity by making the culture, the history, the sort of the religions of the Northeast. I think they should be made part of the mainstream school curriculum. That can be one very good way of making young minds know that that these places exist within the border of the nation state. They are ethnically, religiously, and culturally very, very diverse. And this us-them framework, binary framework opposition, perhaps would minimize if young people are taught more. So that's
okay,
an idea I have.
So we've got from one question from Nairav Giri. Would it be correct to say that because the Northeast people are a minority, that they face challenges and prejudice? That's the question. He's asking. Yeah.
Once again, every marginalized community faces in mainstream India face some or the other kind of violence. So my topic here was racism and the COVID-19 pandemic. So I was focusing on racism, but no, we did not discuss caste, for instance, because that was not part of the discussion today. So of course, the Dalits, the sexual minorities, the religious minorities. So anybody who is marginalized will be the victim of this sort of, violence is never operative across any one vector. Violence is always operative across multiple vectors, and it always chooses the vulnerable. So even if you're a Dalit within a largely Brahminical society, within a largely Brahminical Hindutva society, of course, you would also become the subject of violence. But in this particular talk, of course, I was focusing on racism in the Indian context and its particular implications given this COVID-19 pandemic situation.
Okay, thank you, sir. We've got just few questions. This is from Pooja Mahajan. She asked, resistance against such racial discrimination has often ended in brutal violence and systematic suppression in the mainland India. It leaves a permanent psychological scar on the victim of such discrimination, the burden of which is difficult and sometimes impossible to do away with. So how to stand strong as at the face of such atrocities, according to you? What would be the way out?
I think creating support groups that span not just communities from the Northeast, students and others, but also mainstream Indian communities. I think having these support groups is very, very important. Once again, I would like to refer, I already talked about this film, Akhuni, and there is one man, I think, one of the kids, it's about a group of kids studying in New Delhi, the New Delhi or Old Delhi, I'm not entirely sure, somewhere in Delhi. One particular man is actually the victim of racist violence, something that he talked about, and there is a deep psychological scar, which, he constantly lives that violence. He constantly inhabits the trauma, and he is never able to come out of the trauma, to the extent that his girlfriend finally says, okay, we are going back to Mizoram. We cannot stay in Delhi anymore. Goodbye to Delhi. We are going back to Mizoram. We'll be happier there. So I think having a larger support group that spans across different communities is very, very important in order to help people from the Northeast deal with the psychological trauma. And once again, I express my sincere limitation here, because, as I mentioned, I myself am a mainland Indian. So it would be very presumptuous of me to even try and talk about. I can only imagine it. I cannot actually. I have not suffered it, so I will not know how it feels. I can empathize. I can understand. I can express my solidarity. But it would be impossible for me to, imagine what psychological trauma a person of such racist violence might have had to undergo. So I can only say that having larger support networks, where you interact with people from different communities, where you interact with psychiatrists, with doctors, with professors, with friends, I think that would be a very important first step in helping us deal with the psychological scars of such an abuse.
Okay, so we'll just take one last question. This is for the participants as well, because a lot of questions are pouring, in regarding racism, and it's good that if we had the time and technological full support 100%, we would have actually gone ahead with it. But because we are facing a lot of technical glitches, I would ask only one question that is from one of our faculty, and for the rest of the questions we've kept a record. So I think Mr. Sen will actually definitely get back to you through your email.
I
Because
would,
we definitely have your email ID. So I hope the viewers will not mind. Please bear with us. So the last question was from Manisha ma'am. She's from history department. So she asks, we have seen that the political parties always try to play and use the term identity, but when it comes to issues of racism, especially faced by the Northeast, how do you see things?
Can you kindly repeat the second part of the question, ma'am?
Okay, we have seen that the political parties always try to play and use the term identity, but when it comes to issues of racism, especially faced by the Northeast, how do you see things?
I think that the political parties, once again, this would maybe perhaps this would fall outside the scope of the discussion, but I do think that the political parties from the Northeast themselves, from various parts of the Northeast, they do not take up the issue of racism in the big cities very, very seriously. Because once again, if you look at the Pandemonium case, he was the son of a Congress MLA from Arunachal Pradesh. But did that sort of protect him in any way? It did not. I mean, he was, and if you look at the incident, there were two parts of the incident. The first part where they actually mocked him, they abused him, and there was some sort of skirmish that broke out. And later, when he came back to that area, then they beat him up and killed him. So, the fact that by that time they might have already known that this guy is a MLA, he's son of an MLA, but did that actually protect him? No. So I think political parties from India's Northeast, India's Northeast is also grossly politically underrepresented. How many members and that is something also we need to talk about, how many members of parliament in the Lok Sabha or the Rajya Sabha do we actually have from any state of the Northeast? Do we have one member from every state of the Northeast? We actually don't. So I think gross political underrepresentation also plays a part here. So I think more political representation is very, very necessary in order for mainstream India to really empathize with Northeast India. I think that is very crucial. I think greater representation in both the houses of the parliament is a very, very crucial step in order for the people, in order to enable the people from the Northeast to speak up about such instances of racism.
Thank you, Mr. Sen. We had a wonderful conversation, and Mr. Sen will definitely get back to your queries through your email. So please bear with us. So for today's session, we have another speaker, Dr. Dipti Tamal. Don't mind, Mr. Sen, I'm just logging you off, turning off your screen. Do we have Dr. Dipti with us?
Hello.
Yes.
Hi. Yes, can you hear me?
Okay, ma'am, just give me 2 seconds. Let me just log off Mr. Sen's video. Just bear with us. Just a few minutes. I'm having a lot of technical. This net is pretty slow out here. Okay, Dr. Dipti. Dipti ma'am, is my voice audible to you? Oh, yes.
Yes. I think I will just turn off the video because my internet is really slow. So I think that would help with more clarity.
Okay. Dr. Dipti, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Prajanya Sen, for the wonderful session. Dr. Dipti, I would like to introduce Dr. Dipti as well. Dr. Dipti is currently employed as Assistant Professor in Political Science Department, Darjeeling Government College. Her area of interest, gender, conflict, and regional identities are there, as well as political history with focus on Eastern Himalayan region. She has also tremendously worked on women's movement in the hills as well. She holds a PhD in International Studies, JNU, and is currently an awardee of the Nehru Fulbright postdoctoral grant. Dipti, if you don't mind, I'm just muting you.
Okay.
Her methodology, could you just mute your audio, Dr. Dipti, if you don't mind? Yes. Thank you, Dr. Dipti. Her methodology includes contextualizing and analyzing the contested regional identities of the political history of Darjeeling Hills. And her various, she is also a voracious writer, engaged in reputed journals and web pages, and is currently engaged with the Confluence, a collective of photographers and researchers in Darjeeling Hills and Sikkim. She also uses visual platforms as a means of storytelling of the people, places, and communities of these three regions. I would like to welcome Dr. Dipti, and she will be actually talking about matters which is very much might just be close to most of our hearts. She'll be talking about the COVID-19 scenario seen from the perspective of gender lens. So I welcome Dr. Dipti.
Hello. Am I audible?
Yes, Dr. Dipti, you're audible.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here today, and I apologize for my really bad internet connectivity. So I hope it stays midway, which is why I'll also try to limit my talk and then keep it very brief so that I can cover up most of what I would like to speak upon, and maybe we can follow it up with discussions if my internet permits me. So beginning with, I think Professor Prajanya's lecture was very, very insightful, and he's talked about a very pertinent issue that has confronted us during the time of this pandemic. And sort of what I'm going to say is also going to pick up from where he has left off, and also connecting a lot of issues from in between. So there might be some overlap in terms of what he has said, because when we are talking about identities and when we are talking about these kind of a development that is taking place around us, it's questions such as identities such as gender or race or caste or class. These are all although we tend to see it in terms of isolated concepts, these are always overlapping, and these are always working in intersection with each other. And that is how it is always playing out in our everyday spaces, which is also defining our own positionality in these socio-economic and political spaces that we are located within. So I also found it very insightful because recently I've been engaging with, from my own disciplinary background of what I am interested in as a research scholar in terms of questions of gender and identities and movements in the broadly Himalayan spaces, which is what my further postdoctoral research is also looking at, is in terms of women and conflict in Nagaland and Darjeeling Hills. And that is how I've been developing and expanding. And during this time of the pandemic, thanks to my privileged position also, that I have been able to look into these questions as has been developed during the time. And like Professor Prajanya said rightly, that racism is something that was starkly glaring at us during the time of the pandemic, because what has happened is, although we understand the current pandemic as a global healthcare crisis, what it is now spiraling off into, and what it was initially warned about by different segments of the society also, was that it is also now moving into a full blown economic crisis, which is looming large over our heads, especially in our own context of India, with the figures being recently revealed, which is again not much coverage is being given to the real realities that is now looming like right over our heads, because our media currently is so obsessed with the entire SSR case. And that again also reveals to us the kind of a society that we have become, how gender operates in different spaces, and how we are constantly being defined by these practices, which I believe, like, questions of racism, questions of gender, question of caste, these are all systemically, like, produced realities, which we have constantly being, our own selves being perpetuating it, being part of the system, and constantly reproducing it in our everyday spaces. So what I'll try to do is bring all these realities home in the context of Darjeeling Hills and maybe our own urban rural locations, so that in a way I can maybe try to bring forth how we have been affected by the pandemic, and how we have been engaging with the pandemic, and what has been the socio-economic repercussions of it, and how different groups have been experiencing it, and what are the marginalities that has been coming to the fore during the time of this 6 months lockdown period that we have all experienced. And so, beginning from questions of, let's say, like going right into and picking up from where Professor Sen left off in terms of racism and how gender interconnects with it, and how it played out for people from the hills, let's say specifically. So initially, when the pandemic started and some sort of movement were being allowed, and people were still, scattered in different parts of the metropolitan cities and places, these questions of racism were strongly coming to the front of how people from the Northeast, and here I'm using Northeast as a homogeneous category, which is not in reality a homogeneous category, but the terminology of the Northeast as it is used to define the entire area, which is where again brings us in the Darjeeling Hills in a very complicated position, because we do not fall into the categories of the Northeast, but we often tend to align our own complexities with this same category when we counter question the narratives that comes and the issues that affect us. For instance, how are we affected by questions of racism, or how are we affected by questions of gendered racism, and how it plays out, right? So it also makes us look into the inside in terms of the one very important question that someone had raised on how, like, the categories of Madhises and how it is playing out in the internal. So when, for instance, let's take this instance of the television series Patal Lok that was aired, and then the whole controversy that raged on social media in terms of how Nepali women are projected. So, racism is something we've also always understood in the context of the Northeast, right? But people from the Darjeeling Hills who belong to the Nepali community likewise have faced a different kind of racism, which is similar and different at the same time from the racism that was faced in the context of the Northeast, and how women from the Nepali Hills are then subjected to this kind of a gendered racist practice, which materialized also during the pandemic crisis, right? So, for instance, when a lot of information and a lot of questioning came about how women from Nagaland or Mizoram and all of these were subjected to racism, but also Nepali women who have Mongolian features and how they featured in this debate was something again that was pushed into this homogenized category and identity. But then that is where it started pushing me to think of, like, who makes the Nepali woman, like, how do you define these gendered racist subjectivities that are at play, and so that is something that came forth in the movie that he was talking about also. And despite being the insider, she is the outsider. And when the Patalo controversy happened, what it happened was it pushed us to question practices on the inside. So in Darjeeling Hills, what often happens is not just in the Darjeeling Hills, but in the eastern Himalayan, the larger Himalayan landscape, is we tend to believe that we have a very fair and equal society. And we believe that women in these regions are generally more empowered, in quotes, emancipated, in quotes, and all of these fancy big jargon words that we use to describe a certain sense and idea of women being empowered, right? So where we are seen as more free and more advanced in that terms. And that comes from, I believe, a particular kind of an understanding or markers of how we understand and how we witness patriarchal practices, in terms of how we can see these markers of patriarchal practices, right? So when we say that our women are more empowered, the question is, empowered against who? Like, what is the benchmark that is being placed to, measure this kind of an empowerment? Is it empowerment in isolation in terms of just women within the Darjeeling Hills? Or is it within a particular class of people, or a particular caste, or a particular identity? Or is it within a particular mainstream benchmark that we have placed? So often what comes across through my conversations, through understanding of how myself I've been trained to grow up and question the system in which I was produced, in which constantly was being reproduced myself also through my practices, was, so how do we understand patriarchy, right? We understand that women are more or less, like, women are not empowered because women have the freedom to move around more freely. Women are more advanced in terms of they have a right to free speech, and women are more opinionated, and women are, they are not shamed, or women have the luxury to move about and do have their choice in terms of the partners they choose. Dowry deaths are not reported here. Sexual violence in cases of rape do not take place as frequently as it does in the mainstream, and we are not targeted to sexual or racist slur abuse as it happens in the outside. But and then when you start problematizing these, when you use gender then as a category of analysis to question or to problematize these aspects that we understand as patriarchy, and we bring it especially into the most intimate spaces of the personal, which then goes out to play in the public spaces, we get to see a very different picture of how we understand empowerment in the hills, right? So let's just begin by problematizing that. So when we, going back to the Patal Lok example that I gave, there was this whole campaign against, like, one morning after I finished watching Patal Lok, the next morning I was very, this is a really good series that has finally brought about some questions and realities that needed to be questioned. But then the next morning, as soon as I woke up, I was bombarded with a lot of messages from friends who were like, hashtag Nepali women targeted, hashtag again we are racism, we've been confronted with racism, hashtag all of this hashtags, though I'm not on social media, so I couldn't follow it much. But then I had a different take on it, so I decided to write on it. So I was like, maybe this is also, although we understand how racism and gendered racism operates, it's also time for us to question how we treat women in the inside. How do we perceive of women and questions of gender on the inside? And this is something another junior friend, colleague, she had written a similar piece, and then she had put it up on social media, which went up on Quint, okay? And then she was viciously trolled on social media, right? And she was slut-shamed, she was named, abused, she was very badly trolled, to the extent that it put a lot of mental pressure on her. But then, and there was what the positive side of what I witnessed was, like, there was a certain section of other younger women who came out in solidarity and support of supporting her, that everyone is entitled to a different viewpoint. And what the point she had raised was very important, that although there is a particular portrayal in the scene, it might also give us an insight into how we are presented, and it's time to question that kind of a representation on popular media. So that means, I felt that although it also revealed the true face of the, gendered face of our society, of how women are, slut-shamed for having an opinion simply, of being like, every time you might raise a question of gender or like something that affects women directly, it might be, oh, you are going against the identity, or you are going against the whole Gorkha identity, and all of those questions, right? So any kind of a diversion from these main, so in quotes, like, the larger issue would seem like you are diverting from the cause, right? So questions of gender are then seen as completely separate from the larger important questions. But how has gender been constantly defining our lives? How has these questions constantly being played out in these personal private spaces? And how has it been materializing in the public space? It's visible in terms of how many women political leaders, for example, have made it to the topmost decision-making structures. How many female political leaders can we actually count off? How many political female artists or how many female literary artists or figures can we count off? How many female figures are celebrated? Like, so that kind of question. And even when we celebrate questions of womanhood, or on Women's Day, when we celebrate and give, tokenistic appreciation to women, it's still clouded in the essentialist idea of the feminine, of, how you support or you respect or you understand and glorify women for the femininity they are supposed to represent, right? But any diversion from these practices, right-wise of how, the whole hypersexualized image of the Nepali woman, for instance, how it plays out on the inside also. So when you say that women are free in terms of what they get, the choice they have, the freedom they have in terms of what they get to wear or how they get to walk or how they, I am a lecturer in a government college, right? I'm often being told that I should look like an assistant professor. Now, my question is, how does one look like a professor, or how does one look like a teacher? It depends. Everything is then relegated to your bodily practices of how you behave, or how you choose to speak, or how you choose to, whether you're decently dressed or not, so these categories and markers of who makes a good woman or who makes a bad woman, these are something that are constantly in play inside our own society also. And it only takes us to open our eyes and foreground these questions, use these categories as a category of analysis to just rethink or reapproach our everyday practices from a critical lens. And when we do that, we get to see an entirely different picture, right? So the Nepali language in itself is very gendered, for that matter. You'll have endless abuses for women, which is very, very gendered. And sometimes even in the Nepali language, the marker between, for instance, a mahila or an aime, right? So being a woman is sometimes used as an abuse also. It is just to know, I may just to behave nagarnu. These questions, right? So the very identity that you belong to is then reduced to this category of how you use it as an abusive slur. So that in itself is representative of how and where we position our women. Now, these are the contextual and theoretical realities of basic premises and understanding of how we look at gender, right? And when you contextualize these big, larger theories into your everyday spaces, and then maybe you try to see it or critically analyze it, we get to see a very different picture, and we get to see how these questions have never even come or figured in the discourses on whatever has dominated our whole question, or narratives, or the narratives that we produce from the inside as well. What are the narratives that we ourselves are producing? How are we then reproducing these practices so fiercely that questions of gender or questions of sexuality, for that matter, have hardly figured in these discourses? It's not like these practices have not been prevalent. It's not like this is something new or a phenomena that has just come up yesterday or today or in a day's time, but it was always prevalent. It was a practice. It's a socio-cultural practice that shapes up the societal structure of which we all are a part. And this is a part of the larger system within which we are working, right? And during the pandemic now, what has happened is that these socio-cultural marginalities, these realities that were always existing from prior to the pandemic also, that has now just been exacerbated by the pandemic, right? So for instance, like I said in the beginning, the pandemic right from the beginning was being seen and understood as only a global healthcare crisis, right? But the socio-political and the economic aspects of it, despite severe warnings from so many sections of the society, was completely ignored. None of the states governments or not the central government, they refused to take all these concerns together in one platform and develop approaches or policies or guidelines that would then differentially target these different components or segments of the society that has been affected at different levels. So now when we speak of this, going back to, for instance, let's say when the lockdown was announced, it was announced overnight, right? And this was after the fact that the signs of the pandemic, the signs were already in place. Different countries had already been experiencing, and news were already being circulated, and effort, like, it was already all over the place. But then we pretended that it's not going to affect us. So that's what happened. And when the measures were put into place, it was a very, very, unorganized measure that was put into place. In fact, most people were even suggesting that going into a strict lockdown or simply replicating a model that was followed by the Western countries would not suit us, like, as a whole, right? So even that ways, when you then bring it down, what we can see is how these different margins are then coming to the forefront, right? So for instance, when the pandemic and the lockdown was immediately announced, what happened was, we were not prepared for it in the first place, right? We did not have a set of like pointers or everything, a system in place that would, during this entire 6 months time, prepare us to confront the consequences of the pandemic. So now when there is like guidelines for the lockdown being lifted up, it's as unprepared as it was when it was announced. So now we have both the crisis of the pandemic that we have had to confront in the 6 months period, and the economic crisis added to it. And then comes in the, followed by how these socio-economic inequalities have further been widened by this crisis. And how are we going to deal with this mess that has been created up? Just, although there are many diversions to the reality that is glaring at us in our face, these realities are going to stay with us for a very, very long time. Now, right from the beginning, when the pandemic was being announced, feminist network advocacy groups had been constantly warning that prior to this also, we have seen other epidemics, we have seen other natural disasters, we have seen other natural calamities where different sections of the communities have been impacted differently. So taking from that, we need to then develop models, we need to come up with solutions that will then not be one uniform straitjacket model, or a uniform policy that will be implemented across everyone, but target these different segments, these different sectors differently, so that these marginalities which are then being brought to the fore, it's something that will be addressed, right? So now suddenly, although a lot of us are pretending to be surprised or pretending to be heartbroken and very, very surprised by these inequalities that came to our faces glaring during the pandemic, these are realities that was always there. It was always there, right? So that's just been strengthened further. The divide has just been widened further, and the gap has become so huge that it's almost impossible to bridge this gap now, right? So then bringing this pandemic to the Darjeeling Hills, I'll try to sort of contextualize it in the hills, because that's how I believe that's a practice that I've been doing or trying to do in my research in the past few years, of trying to contextualize whatever I learn or I see in terms of theory, so that it makes much more sense in terms of how we can contextualize it in the local and bridge the gap between this whole global, national, local divide that we constantly see at play. Also, because I do believe that there's so little that is produced from the region in terms of data or statistics or figure that we have. So, for instance, when this whole idea of the lockdown was imposed, what happened was, the tourism industry was brought to an entire standstill in the Darjeeling Hills, right? The tea plantation was, the tea plantation was a complicated affair, because initially they went for a shutdown, then they lifted it up, and then there was a partial lifting. And although they said that the SOPs were put into place, from the conversations that I've managed to have with a few of the tea garden workers through other contacts who've been in touch with the people who are working in the tea garden or with migrant laborers, what has come to our fore is, recently only there was this incident of the Happy Valley Tea Estate, which was again suppressed, and news have not been brought to the front. The narratives have not yet come to the front. But what happened was, a lot of the workers and the working class wage workers they've not been paid their full salary, right? And a lot of people working in the tea garden, men, women alike, they've been facing, the tea garden is already in a state of a huge disaster anyways. So the impact that women have been facing in these sectors it's now again, there is, when we talk about gender and when we talk about women, I would like to emphasize that firstly, although these are just markers of identity and these are critical lens through which we can understand the socio-political economic spectrum, these are something that does not operate in isolation. This is something we really need to understand as well. So here, much of my what I'm going to speak about and what I've added is also coming from my position of a particular middle urban working class woman, and the observations that I've made through dialogues with other colleagues and with other women who have been working in terms of in the same privileged position where we've sort of had the privilege to at least have access to our livelihood. But the challenges that has confronted us, it's completely also different from the challenges that the rural working women have faced, right? So recently, during this time, in terms of data for that, what I would say is, again, because of the lockdown, collecting data has become another difficult challenge, and how we restructure or re-understand these critical methodologies is something that takes an entire discourse or a debate. But Zuban has been working in a lot of, Zuban is the publishing feminist house that has been working, and recently what they did was, like, they've been working with their partner organizations and research scholars in different parts of the Northeast and Darjeeling, Sikkim Hills also. It's that what came across in one of these surveys on the COVID workforce, for instance, is that one of the report was on the Assam working women, which was collected out of like 200 sample random assessment samples. So I'll just give you a brief statistics on that, where the participants were aged between 26 to 35 years and categorized into casual workers, domestic workers, regular salaried worker, household enterprises, and where 42% of women were married, 58% are single. When we talk about single, it's widowed, separated, divorced, and never married. Right? So 86% of women from this sample size, they stated that they were out of work. 4.9% partially worked partially. 9% continued to work. 67.7% have not been paid. 20% received full payment. 11% received partial payment. 73.5% received, they are willing to go back to work. 19% are unsure. And 6.6% are they have said that they will not go to work, right? And the domestic workers who were working in the region, in the hills, some of them who I knew personally before when I was staying in rented places, 2-3 of them were from Assam. So I've been in touch with them, and they've been talking about how now they have gone back to the fields, like, and their whole, when I was talking about conversations on how the gender dynamics of the COVID, because I wanted to get a input and insight from how it would affect different segments of the society and how women from these different segments would then be affected. A huge section of the middle urban class working women have relied for a long time now on the service that has been provided by the domestic workers and helpers who've been working and coming to provide these basic services. Now, for this section of the upper class, middle class women, they've had to go back to the working spaces, which is now work from home, where the personal and the public has now come into the home, right? So what has happened is it's brought forth this glaring disparities between like men and women. Here I'm just talking about the binaries, because here the mention is in the emphasis is on a heterosexual normative family order that we are talking about. Okay, so the differences in terms of the care work and the increase in the care work that women have been confronted with has increased manifold, right? So even managing your basic everyday schedule is very difficult for a woman as compared to a male member, right? And there was this recent publication which was talking, which has reported on. I can send links later through my email, where in terms of how, like, there's been a spurt in the rise of publications and resource work from male members as compared to the number of female who have been able to engage in this productive labor participation of performing and producing more academic work, because they've been increased, the burden of care work has increased on women, right? This is care work I'm talking of in terms of inside the small heteronormative household family order that we are talking about. again here it also necessitates us to question how do we understand care work, right? So traditionally now, before this whole work from the liberal work from home has been imposed upon us, traditionally also women have been engaged in these spaces of where their work has been categorized into both productive and reproductive work, and work after the neoliberal order has been basically, we understand it in terms of paid occupation, right? But women have been constantly and for historically been engaged in these traditional forms of productive work. Say, for instance, you might have a small family enterprises where, or a small family business or a small family farm. We're coming from middle class families where women have been engaged in domestic work inside the house. They are working outside of the house as an added extension by helping in these household family businesses or shops or enterprises or farms, or doing all of these works which they see as an extension of their own domestic work. But it's not counted as work, right? Because work is categorized as something that is paid. And then apart from this, you have the domestic reproductive work in which women are engaged in terms of care inside the household, the care work that they are constantly producing and giving inside the household, of taking care of the elderlies, of parents, of families, of children, of their partners, and everything that is taking place. Now, this has all been by bringing the professional workspace into these spaces. This has sort of like shrunk, the place has shrunk. Like, you know, it's what was earlier, what feminists have always been saying is the personal is political, is now what is actually glaring in front of us. And women are now confronted with this reality of the double burden of work and oppression that feminists have always been saying for a very, very long time. What had happened after the neoliberal order is this image of empowerment had completely again made it complex and problematized the entire idea of how we understand empowered women, right? So if you see in the popular culture also, you see a lot of these, you know, even social media memes is something that I see, and popular culture, we see a representation of this whole super mom, or like, you know, Tarzan mom or Wonder Woman and all of these, where women are like, you know, they have the superpower to balance all of the workplace difficulties, challenges, and their work, and then yet also manage to successfully, you know, garner their whole strength to manage the household and chores and everything, and yet be perfect in all aspects, all matters of life. And where it's presented as a model, like, you know, for how women should then, younger generation of younger women should be trained to emerge as these perfect images of supermom or superwomen or Wonder Women, which is almost seen as an invincible power or something that women are naturally gifted with. But that is where we start that is where we start problematizing these notions of, just for instance, like, you know, you might come out of your luxury space and then just try doing household work of an 8-hour work in the household on your own, where and then you would see that it's impossible to even have that kind of a physical strength to both be able to balance and emerge as a super mom or a superwoman or a Wonder Woman in the first place. So this is something that has not been questioned, and in fact it's been reproduced so strongly within the patriarchal order that we are constantly training and grooming and ingraining these realities to build up women to think in a particular order, right? But again, if you see, these are notions that are now being questioned, which is a slight, I think that is something that Professor Ashwini Deshpande, in a recent paper that she had produced with Naila Kabir, both working on feminist economies, of how this kind of a confrontation with reality maybe also has the scope where few of us are also imagining and hoping that what the pandemic has brought us and forced us to confront these realities. Maybe there may be a slight possibility, hopefully, of imagining a world order where we actually think of re-altering these practices. For instance, you have cases of now, because partners are working in the household together, there has also been few percentage of women reporting that their partners have been helping and contributing in the share of the household work. But again, the household work is in terms of maybe they are looking after the children's studies, or maybe they are looking or helping with homeschooling, because now homeschooling has also been brought to the house, right? Adding to the already existing labor and care work that women were providing, which was now that's something that families are now burdened with. So that is something that is also, these kind of small changes are taking place, but I don't see it as an alteration of gender relations, again, because men have been historically privileged in a position of privilege to be 10 steps advanced ahead of women, where women are limited by these challenges and family obligations, which is something, again, if you bring it closer to home, if you look at your own urban working space, let's take it in the case of the Darjeeling Hills, or like Darjeeling town, which represents the urban sector, where a few percentage of women are engaged in the teaching profession, because that's where most women are concentrated, as it is seen as the right job for women, right? So a lot of women, even then, if you see if there might be a differences in wage differences, and if it is not the wage differences, you will see in terms of the respect, or in terms of the differences that are meted out to men and women, female and male colleagues are completely different, where opinionated women are again have to face the brunt of being opinionated in the first place. Major decision-making bodies, women are always kept at a lower level in terms of the hierarchy of being in those spaces. And also in terms of, for instance, let's take the case of promotions, where women are delayed because of family obligations, where cases of transfers, where women have to face more challenges in terms of who's going to look after the family if I'm transferred. Those kind of challenges are something that is not confronted by the male colleagues, as that would be confronted by the female colleagues. And also, how many of our workspaces are, gender neutral or gender friendly in that matter, that how many of our workspaces have, for instance, grievance redressal cell or the sexual harassment at the workplace bill in order or in practice, and how many of our workplaces have creches available, which is actually, government order or a diktat or a rule policy that should be made available to female colleagues with young children. How many of our workspaces have working women hostel provisions made available? I'm not even talking about the sexual minorities here or the third gender here, because that is something we refuse to even acknowledge or talk about, right? So here I'm specifically focusing on the category woman, and that too as a homogeneous category right now for the sake of this talk. But these are the difficulties and these are the realities that are constantly confronted in front of us. Now, again, contextualizing it in the case of and this is something that's not going to change after the post-pandemic period also. These gendered realities are going to stay where it has stayed in the beginning. It was there, it is there throughout, it will stay after the pandemic also. But these are realities which I feel that needs to be confronted, and that needs to be brought to the forefront of how different sections are always being impacted whenever, especially this kind of a pandemic-like situation takes place. It's always going to be doubly oppressive or doubly difficult for a particular section as compared to a different section. It's not to say that the pandemic has affected only women or women more than men, but it's also, if you bring in questions of caste, or if you bring in questions of lower oppressed groups or economically disadvantaged groups, the picture is going to be completely different, because these identities are again constantly at play. And how we, for instance, if you look at then when you bring the whole question of care work that I was talking about, if you extend it to the public spaces, we will see how, for instance, before the pandemic also, there has been very little investment in the healthcare sector. And the healthcare has been in a very, very bad situation anyways, which is again going to continue after the pandemic space. So that has confronted us to the reality of the healthcare workers who are in the forefront of this pandemic, who've been managing it in the forefront. How many families have then, where while the government talked about social distancing, how many families were even healthcare workers were able to, actually practice this whole idea of social distancing, or how many families were being put at risk, what kind of facilities were available then to these women caregivers, especially if you see, because we don't have healthcare facilities in place, especially in the rural areas and further in the marginalized peripheries, what we see is that, for instance, the ASHA workers, right, the SHG groups, that is what has been in the forefront with limited training, with limited, basic facilities being given to them, who have been in the forefront, working and looking after these, taking care and giving all of these things. Only recently we saw how the healthcare workers and temporary workers have been out protesting against the kind of treatment that has been meted out to them in terms of the payment that they have not received for the kind of work that they have been talking about. And then that is something that has confronted us. Again, the gendered and caste class realities of it is something that is starkly in front of us, and endless resources are available if you want to have a look at it. So that is one confrontation. Now, again, if you look at the hills, for instance, what has happened is a lot of our women, like you see, a lot of our women are engaged in local community practices, such as, like, for instance, the Hat Bazaar, the local hat, where women are working as vegetable vendors. Women have been working and selling their local products, right? So now that has been hugely impacted. For instance, this data that a few conversations that I've collected from female workers who've been running the Hat Bazaar in Sikkim, for instance, their difficulties when we asked them they were told that, first of all, they did not have much information because awareness programs were again not conducted, or they were not informed in detail about what the whole pandemic was about. Most of them, when questioned of, like, whether or not, like, why were they wearing masks in the first place, like, most of them also, I believe, answered that, if we don't wear it, then the police is going to fine us, right? So you see this kind of a gap in terms of information and access that is dissipated at the grassroots also, right? So how does that then play out in terms of, again, because we are in a period time where social media has infiltrated our lives to such a huge extent. Facebook has now also become locally also a source of reliable information, which is again very problematic, because there is like endless unfiltered information that is taking place in the social media. So people are now relying on the social media. Again, there's a gap in terms of who then has access to the social media. So the younger female entrepreneurs were more informed in terms of the older generation women who've had no access to this. Another problem they cited was that initially, when they would come from far flung places, they would have to pay, for instance, say like 50 rupees or 30 rupees per day to travel, bringing their products for sale. Now, because there's been movement has been halted and access to transport is difficult, either they have to walk long distances, bringing their products to sell in the market, or they have to now shill in more money in terms of like 200 rupees, 300 rupees for big cars. These are realities that are starkly glaring at us in our faces. Now, how do we come up with solutions that will then target these realities, right? Now that schooling has also shifted into more online teaching and online schooling, where again we are struggling with basic electricity and internet facilities. That is an altogether different debate. But how women now, because they themselves have had limited access to education, where a huge section of the families are like single mothers who are either widowed or who are divorced or who've been living on their own. They've been solely managing the household on their limited economy, right? So now they have to tutor these children. So they've relying upon students who are back in their houses from far from areas, who are college going students or class 10, 12 pass out students. They are the ones who are now providing the tutoring work to these students of the other families. And they now have to again manage out money in terms of budgetary limits to how they can ensure that these children have access to the education that is being provided online. Again, endless stories of how parents of the rural families have been struggling to get a basic smartphone to have access to the online schooling, so that, and the kind of loan and debts now they are further embroiled in. This is another reality that is confronting us, right? So that is there. Recently, I came across, like when I was working with the Confluence for another story, what a person, Tarun from Riot in
There seems to be some kind of a technical glitch. Dipti ma'am, can you hear us? I think we've lost connection with Dipti ma'am. Dipti ma'am? She's still here. Yes, Dipti ma'am? Please have patience with us. There seems to be some technical issues due to the weather as well. Seems like we've lost connection with Dipti ma'am. Please have patience with us. Let me just fix this. I request our participants, the audience, to have patience with us. Yes, Dipti ma'am, can you hear us?
Yes, yes, I can. I'm so sorry. My network is like really bad today.
Okay, we can totally understand. It's the same.
Yeah, I
Dipti
think.
ma'am, you may continue.
Yeah. So yeah, that these are the kind of realities that I think that has been confronting us, and that's been so glaring in the forefront during the time because of the pandemic, and which we have been forced to confront and question, and hopefully now that when we move ahead in terms of what kind of what kind of a solution do we want, or what are the policies that we are going to develop that takes into account all of these realities, so even like I'm not even talking about the broader theoretical context and broader theoretical generalizations, observations that are coming about, and something that has been stressed on regularly, but these are realities. If we just open our eyes and look around us, it's there every day, playing out in our everyday spaces. And this is something that most of us have been warned about right from the beginning, that it's not the immediate period of the lockdown that's going to be harming us, or the kind of setback that we're going to receive, but the follow up on in terms of what it's going to happen. It's not going to be like, okay, because that's the general opinion from the conversation that I've had with a lot of people around me here. It's in terms of also because we are so tuned to this whole strikes and band mentality. It's like we've come to sort of believe that we've come to believe that it's going to be over soon, and then things are going to get back to normal. But this normal is not going to be like the normal that we've been used to prior to the pandemic. In this new situation that is going to be confronting us, unless we develop a community solidarity, which I feel has been deteriorating amidst us for a very long time, because we are a society traditionally that we've relied upon community support, right? So I think it's also each one of us are accountable for these kind of realities that is taking place around us, which we've chosen very conveniently to be blind to, despite some of us being in privileged positions to be able to do something about it. Unless we acknowledge these realities of knowing and understanding and accepting it, and playing our parts that we each can play in terms of how do we, for instance, make just even disseminate information, or play our part in terms of building, for instance, if you see what is happening now is, first of all, the healthcare has been a very bad shape, right? And then because of the healthcare services now being fully tuned to the COVID pandemic, other inequalities, other health issues that people are confronted with has now been completely sidelined. We don't have any kind of access to basic and women's health issues. Not just women, but men and women suffer from different kind of diseases, and women have been confronted. Like the women's health issues is an entirely different gamut of area which needs to be, which is there, which has been there, right? So access to these kind of basic healthcare facilities, it's now being denied, and because of the information that is percolating from social media, what has happened is that there is so much of information, or rather misinformation, about the entire pandemic, about how people are then taking the pandemic and relying upon these rumors to spread more misinformation, so to spread more chaos, that has resulted in also a deterioration of the solidarity that was always there in community lifestyles. For instance, earlier in the beginning, we did see a lot of people coming out and helping, and that was in the beginning, that rations were being supplied, people were being distributed food, and all of that was happening in the beginning. But then eventually, now that the cases are rising, there's been a spike in increase and cases are now being reported. This whole idea of witch hunting, which if I may use the term, it's in terms of how those families are then isolated, or basic government protocols are not being followed, people are being randomly lifted and taken up to quarantine facilities, even though guidelines are available in terms of with basic symptoms or mild symptoms you can stay at home. But the kind of hounding then that takes place of the families, and how we as communities have not been able to then support that system, but rather be a part of the system that spreads the panic and the chaos, that has widened this gap. So if we just look around also, for instance, how many wage laborers, women wage earners who were dependent on the tourism industry, who the bhariyas, the female bhariyas who were working in Darjeeling, are now seeking methods to somehow go back home, because they do not have access to basic livelihood. Most of them have been depending on basic small amounts of charity from from helpful families who've been helping on the individual basis, and they've not been able to. The documentary I was talking about before I got disconnected of it, there is this one story about it's not a story but a reality documentary of this woman who's come from Nepal and who's a female migrant who's been working and there, and who's worked so hard to a family of 4 or 5 children, and how she got her eldest admitted into college because she wanted better education facilities for him and wanted a better lifestyle, therefore for a future generation. Have now when contacted later, and I was following up with Tarun about have they been in touch with her after, and what happened to them was unfortunately the eldest son, for whom she had worked so hard and for who had been given scholarship facilities in a good college in Darjeeling, later on passed away. So her whole dream and struggle of seeing her family flourish that ways was also shattered, and how the kind of discrimination, the kind of problems, they have been now facing in terms of because there's been a standstill of the economy, tourism economy. There's been because the entire Darjeeling, as we know, depends upon the tourism economy. Many more families have been lost out. Independent women entrepreneurs who've been running small restaurants, small businesses, have now been completely gone out of business, and they are being the kind of loans they have over their head of how they are going to then manage the family income, of how they are now going to cope up with this burden. All of this is something that is, this is the economics of it, of how this is a glaring reality that is hugely there in front of us. Now, and then when we bring this economics and the politics of it together, and we use it to understand how different identities, then for instance someone's caste, or for instance someone's gender, or for instance someone's other identities are at play, then we understand how these kind of socio-economic development have an impact on each one of us based on our markers of identity, of how we are positioned in this society, and how it's going to play out in terms of where we are going to be positioned in the society, or how we are going to be impacted by these differences. And that is something that has been talked about by so many feminist advocacy groups in terms of earlier cases of the Ebola outbreak, or other disasters also that that policy makers in the feminist sphere have been talking and emphasizing on this reality of how women are differently impacted by every kind of development that takes place. So why we need not just a gender neutral, but using and adopting a gender lens to bring in these realities to now then work towards a development of policies or guidelines or whatever measurements that we are going to follow up in terms of how are we going to now confront this reality that is there staring at us in front of our faces. So how are we then prepared now to deal with this post-pandemic period, or how are we going to be now confronting these gendered realities, and how are we going to be then playing our own parts, or how are we going to be then acknowledging these realities? So these are some of the critical questions that have always been that constantly plays out in my head, and I do believe as scholars or as people practicing and working in this field, it's also our duty to be raising these critical questions. So I'm here more with more questions rather than having solutions to all of these, because I feel that it is our duty to raise these important questions that is playing out and shaping up our everyday realities, which we otherwise tend to sort of overlook and believe that it doesn't exist amongst us, or it doesn't affect us in a way that it would affect someone else. So I hope that these realities have come out in my talk, and I would like to wrap it up here because the internet is giving me really some issues out here. So I would like to maybe follow up with discussions and questions that have come up. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Deepti. Thank you for a wonderful conversation which we could actually have access to. And yes, not only speaking from a woman's perspective, and I wouldn't like to sound very subjective, but yes, the content of your lecture was very much something which we all of us could relate to, something which we call it as lived experience. So, considering the fact that you are suffering or going through a lot of technical glitches at the moment, and considering the fact that the weather today is not favoring us, so let's move ahead with the question. There are a lot of interesting questions for you, Dr. Deepti. So, ask you if my voice is audible.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, Deepti ma'am, the first question is from Meghna Khati. She asks, various ways of feminism have put forth their own ways of tackling with this gender issue. But in the hills, do we have any such way to tackle gendered consequences of pandemic in particular?
Yeah, I think I read that question in between, and it's a very interesting question. So, I don't think so. That is precisely what I was also trying to emphasize on, and I would like to have a discussion around it. It's because I do believe that we've not yet arrived upon this place or position or space where we can talk about questions of gender or sexuality. So this wave that you are talking about is something I personally have not seen materialize in the hills as of yet. But then, like I said in the beginning about the Patalo controversy, when I did see that space on social media where a group of there was a counter narrative that was coming into the forefront, although it was by a very small minority, but that counter narrative did come into place. And I've been here now, this is my 5th year that I've come back to the hills, and from the first year to the 5th year I do see a lot of difference in terms of the kind of people I've interacted with, kind of a lot of people that otherwise I did not know in the beginning also, where such debates are taking place on of this narrative that needs to build up from the inside. So specifically about the wave that you're talking to deal with the gender dynamic of the pandemic, no, it has not come about, because we have not yet even developed a proper policy guideline to deal with the pandemic specifically in the hills in terms of how it has affected us. But yeah, you have also mentioned, I don't think so that there's been a specific gendered policy or any wave of feminism that we have actually seen in the hills. And questions of gender and feminism are yet to be brought out into the public discourse or narratives that we constantly talk about. Not just gender, but issues of caste, class, nothing. Because we've just been our narratives have been predominated by the identity question, and rightly so, understandably so. But these narratives have not yet been broken down to bring forth the nuances of the multiplicity of identities that are at play within this larger narrative also. I hope that answers your question, but you can get in touch with me through email for further dialogue on this also.
Thank you, Dipti ma'am. We've got another question from Devyani from Marginal. What are
Yes.
your views on how COVID-19 has affected on domestic violence rates?
Yes, like I said in the beginning, also that see, general in the beginning itself, when the pandemic was started, a lot of reports were coming about, and a lot of feminist advocacy groups had already brought about prior pre-policy guidelines of how this issue needs to be tackled about, not just in terms of domestic violence, but the other forms of the violence, emotional, mental abuse, and how to that. But yeah, my views is that yes, definitely there's been a spike in it, there's been an increase in it. But in terms of data or concrete data, that is something that I hope will now start being developed in terms of, because in terms of statistics or figure that you're talking about, that is something that is yet to materialize, because all of us have been brought to a standstill, and collecting data and information that way as it was in the pre-pandemic period has not been possible. But even through dialogues and conversations and social media, that information that we have been circulating, there definitely has been an increase. And there's also been an increase, for instance, in the amount of the counseling helpline numbers that have been opened up specifically to deal with cases of mental health issues and domestic violence cases. The number of even the NCW recently published a data in terms of the spike. I can send you the link to that resource in terms of how there's been an increase in the number of phone calls and emails that they've been received because of the spike in the gender, domestic violence. And that is something, even again, if you contextualize it in the Darjeeling Hills, it's something which we don't talk about, but it's a very strong reality that we live with in our own spaces, so it's, which is often disguised under this name of love, which I've talked about with not just, and also there's a perception amongst us that we believe certain issues and aspects, we often tend to categorize people from different categories to as if it's limited to that category of people. Like when you understand violence or domestic violence, we tend to immediately associate it with the lower working class strata, that it's limited to that space and it doesn't affect those in the urban middle class spaces. But it's not true, right? Domestic violence is something that cross across all class, caste, whatever identities you talk about, it's there. So even in the past few years of my living here, and when I've talked with colleagues or some friends who've experienced it personally, the thing that is often told to me is but my partner loves me. It's only in times of I have to make sure that I don't anger him or I don't irritate him, and it's only when he's angry he sort of abuses me or hits me, but otherwise he does love me in normal times, right? So the onus then lies on the woman to make sure that she does not trigger off a particular emotion to be subjected to that kind of a violence. So that is again a reflection of the gender order that we are working within to confront these realities, which is otherwise just an outcome of the gender structure that we are all a part of.
Thank you, ma'am. We've got another question from Simon Shetri. The question which he asked, I think for most of his part, you've actually given the answer to it. But for the sake of it, I'm talking about the questions again. In Darjeeling Hills, it is said that women are given much more freedom and platform to express themselves. But I find a problem when women are questioned in what they wear, what they drink or eat, and so on. As you even came up with a statement made to the boys saying, don't be like girls and all. So do you really feel that our society still needs to change themselves in this matter? What I feel till now is our society is kind of hypocrite in such a matter.
That's a very interesting observation, and I believe that I do align with your thoughts here. So it's more like an observation. I would take this as an observation rather than as a question. But it's every time I have this discussion around even progressive male counterparts, whenever it comes to questions of gender, it's often it gets complicated in the sense that a lot of us choose to believe that we are very progressive in that terms, right? So that is where I believe, and that's why why I'm very passionate about questions of gender, and I identify myself as a feminist because feminism has given answers to most of the questions that I've been struggling with since I was a girl child and growing up, right? So I do agree that we are a hypocrite in that sense because, like I said, it's also because we tend to see everything on the outside, right? We identify everything with the other, that these are practices that are not prevalent in our society, that women are more progressive here because our women can go out freely, but then again we have this practice of in Nepalima, if you have to say it, it's like 6 बजी पछि र बत्ती बाले पछि घर आयो भने त्यो केटीको चरित्रलाई राम्रो भनिँदैन भन्ने is something we have grown up with, right? And how safe is it for women also to be after out in the dark, and if a woman returns at night, or if a woman drinks, or if an adult woman chooses to smoke, and what Professor Prajanya Sen was also talking about this hypersexualized woman on the outside, how much of an effort have we put to look at it on the inside? Like, how much of it have we really effort have we given to question it on the inside, right? So every time, like, from the time I've joined my job till the time it's been 4 years now, I'm constantly asked with this question. Nobody asks me about in the workplace, which is supposed to be a very professional space. Like, it's always about when are you getting married? Like, so these are the markers in which you identify the success of a woman, right? So unless you are married or you have a family or all of it, you are seen as a complete woman, like, taking from Raymond's title line, the complete man. It's like the complete woman is identified only when certain markers are fulfilled by women. So yeah, I do agree with you that it's time now that these questions are raised. It's time now that women also start questioning these realities and confront these realities, because often what again happens is the danger of it is, again, there's so much of information on social media, like I said, where feminism is now being, there's so much of a complication around the question of feminism. It's like about, like, reversing the power structure of, like, it's been almost equated with male bashing, or if there's a Me Too, then there's a equal Me Too for men. So sort of that thing. So, historically it has to be rooted. And when we are reproducing these narratives, it's very important for us to understand what kind of a narrative are we producing then? Is it going to challenge the particular structure, the structures of powers that operate in creating new forms of inequalities, or actually imagining a society where, the idea of inclusivity, it's like real, it's not just limited to formal structures of equality, but where we take into account all of these inequalities to actually imagine a social order where people are just treated as people and respected for the differences and on the grounds of humanity, I would say, like, so that is something, yeah, I agree with what you say.
We've got another question from Prajanya Sen, that is Mr. Prajanya Sen. He says he's got like 2 questions in total. So this first question is, during this COVID-19 pandemic, we have noticed a growth spurt in domestic violence against women. How would you interpret or read these instances? Dipti ma'am?
Yeah, sorry. So so this is similar to a question I think answered about domestic violence, no? So yeah, I mean, there's no interpretation of it. I do understand that it's a result of a particular gender order that we all live in and we refuse to acknowledge. And like I said, that it's also directly related to the pandemic, this spike in increase, which was again something that was warned about by feminist groups right in the beginning, where, return of the migrant workforce, which is something I couldn't dwell much upon in the talk due to the internet connection. But like, for instance, let me give you an example of this whole project, which is, community development project, which is extensively covered up. Again, I can send a link to it later on, where women have been working in the Mahakali River Basin, which is like a, transboundary river thing of between India and Nepal, where women are engaged in a lot of community development workspaces, right? So these women are in the forefront in the management of the river related issues of development and issues centered around the river, right? So how they have been functioning and working, and how over the past, because most of the male members, due to the calamities and the earthquakes and ecological shifts in those part of Nepal, people have been migrating mostly to India and other places for work, male members, right? So there was a shift in terms of the gender relations, in terms not alteration but a shift, right, where earlier women who are now segregated to certain spaces were now coming out of those traditionally designed gender roles to function and work in these public spaces as community development workers, right? So they had to initially, some women who were interviewed were told, like, they were also criticized for a lot. Nepalima, there's a saying that poti besi baseko ramro haina, right, which is again a very gendered proverb in the first place. So those kind of confrontation that women had to face for just going out of the house and taking leadership roles, but that changed the perception of women for themselves, of how they view themselves and how they've been challenging these traditional roles to take part in these roles, right? Now, with the return of these migrants, this is again something that research that I hope will be worked upon later also, which I'm sure it will, of how this return of the reverse migration has also impacted the gender relations that has been in place right now. What does it mean when these male members who have been on the outside now come back to the homes, right? Like the tree garden workers who reported that now the son has come back and he's out of job. The male family member, her father has come back who's now out of job. Now it also restricts her movement and pushes back and reaffirms the earlier traditional gender roles, where the limited temporary alteration is now falls back to the earlier spaces of how traditional roles were designed according to the gender order. So that obviously then research has already been there's already enough research to show linkages between, like, increase in the number of domestic violence, which is correlated to questions of unemployment, increase in poverty, and rise in consumptions of liquor, which is something that has been taking place, and which has been that is also another thing which has resulted in the trigger, I believe, in this number of increase and spike in domestic violence. So I do believe it is directly an outcome of, domestic violence, where women are subjected to this kind of violence. It's a gendered reality, so this is something I think we cannot deny. There's something reality which confronts us.
Hello, am I audible, ma'am?
Yes, yes.
Yes, ma'am. We've got another question from Mr. Prajanya Sen, but considering the fact that you have network issues, we'll get back to the questions, because we need to give chances to other people as well, and you can always get back to his, as an answer to him through email as well. So the next question is from Rishabh Jha. He questions, we have been coming out of these gender discrimination and marginal differences for years, and still we are on the same stair of the ladder with which we started. Why is it that even after so many protests, steps, and even after having the support of citizens from all the parts of our country in the favor of women, we have not yet managed to get rid of this? Who is that culprit? Dipti, ma'am?
Hello?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's a pretty interesting observation. And yeah, these are social realities that we have been living with and a part of, and constantly also reproducing it in our everyday spaces, right? Like I mentioned in the beginning, we've been part of a social order that we are constantly reproducing every day through our own lived realities, where men, women, others, every one of us have been part of this reproduction. So yeah, it's going to what has happened due to the number of protests and movement that you have said is definitely there has been been a huge change in terms of the laws, the number of laws and policies that we have now in place, which were earlier historically denied to women. A lot of changes have also taken place from, if you compare to the position and situation of women in the 60s or 70s to now in the 2020s. And these are realities which are not going to change overnight. I mean, it's a long social revolutionary process that we are talking about, right? So it's not like you can identify one person or one group of people for being part of this. It's a systemic crisis, and I do believe that it will take a lot of time, and every time with new developments, with new changes, the ideas of patriarchy, the forms of practices is also constantly producing new forms of oppressions and new forms of challenges for men, women, and all of us alike, right? So I do believe that it's when we start confronting these realities, when we start questioning these realities in our everyday spaces, that is where the real changes are going to take about. Like, how do we see it and bring it to our immediate closest to our personal spaces, and how can we bring about a change in these limited spaces? And that will then slowly maybe move on to building, while we continue with the larger battle alongside also, but how do we work on confronting these realities in the immediate spaces? So yeah, I would not say that there's been no shift or no change at all in terms of how women were located earlier, and like it's the same now, but there's been a huge transformation that cannot be denied, and that's also an outcome of all these progressive movements and struggles that have taken place in different parts of the world. And hopefully more such questions will be raised in the future to bring about that change that we are talking about here.
Thank you, ma'am. We've got another question. We've got another question from one of our faculty members, Mr. Vivek Kalikote from Department of Sociology. His question is, can we see that in this pandemic situation, the women who have a job and looking after the families can be seen as a mobilization in their status and decision making, or can we see it as a under role of women in patriarchy? Let me just unmute you, ma'am, because...
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm sort of unsure about where this question is leading to, or what sir would be asking me directly. But as far as I understood, is he trying to ask me about like whether the working class women in the urban spaces would have better position than the rural class spaces? Is that it? I think it's that only.
I mean, that's how his question is, yeah, that is one part of the question, ma'am. But I think what he really wants to look into is that, stating the current pandemic situation, his question is like, because women are engaged more with work, apart from the professional, they're looking into the domestic chores as well. So his question is like, handling all these issues at a time, is it a matter about, a challenge for them?
Yes. Okay. So, like I said in the beginning, here when we talk about the women as a category, it's also like divided by these class positionalities that we're working in, right? So this work from home has definitely brought about a huge challenge in terms of the care work that is divided between partners, or in terms of how women are now questioning their whole role of how productive can they be in terms of like, let's say I'm just taking the field of academia about like, how can they produce more work, or do they have enough time to balance between the household work, care work, and then being productive and carrying on with their regular classes and all of it. Because online classes takes more double times the effort than what you would be doing normally, right? So what kind of burden, and how are then women rescheduling or scheduling their time to manage between these kind of work and this professional work, now that the professional has come to the home space? So here is where I do believe that, like I said in the beginning, that for some of us, we've been trying to see some hope in terms of what the post-pandemic or normal would look like, right? So when there have been reports of number of women stating that their household work has increased or doubled, there are also reports, although at a very low limited level, of how women have been seeing men now being part of this domestic household work and sharing their responsibilities in the caregiving work, right? So when you talk about mobilization, it's in terms of now women also confronting these realities, which is what we term as the double oppression of working women, is something that was there in the feminist literature, but something that was always there and talked about, but had not been confronted by women, because the personal and the professional was strictly divided, right? So the women were going out of the household and then going on to carry on with their professional life. That is where the idea and image of the super mom was constantly being reproduced. But now that the professional has come to the personal, and when these realities are being confronted, women are also now beginning to question these realities, and they are playing a part in terms of managing some sort of an arrangement where these kind of realities are now slowly maybe being challenged in their personal spaces. And that's where I like to keep the hope that hopefully this will be a certain kind of an intervention where we can also see a positive implementation in terms of maybe now, because that's how like feminism has also progressed further, how progressive movements have come into place when women have also been forced to confront these realities which were otherwise glaring but kept hidden out of their own eyesight, right? So now that there is this immediate bringing and closing of spaces between the personal and the professional. Now women are also being able to confront these realities, and women are also now bringing forth these realities to the fore. So that is where I also hope and I believe that this will definitely act as a trigger of mobilization and create a new discourse in terms of that is yet to be seen. Like only time can tell now how these developments are going to impact upon questions of gender and women in the household.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. I think one of our faculty members, let me just unmute you. One of our faculty members from Department of History, I think she does state similar question. So I wouldn't like to, pose this question to you again. But if you feel like you would like, if you feel like you need to add something extra to the point, then you may so. I think it's from Manisha, ma'am. I hope, Manisha, I hope you will not mind, because we are having a lot of technical issues from Dipti ma'am's side as well. So Dipti ma'am, if you can see the question in the chat box, would you like to answer the question? Because it's quite similar to what Mr. Vivek Kalikoti was asking about.
Yes, correct. Yeah, I think I've answered that question, so I wouldn't like to dwell upon it because. So sorry, I can't take all of it in detail.
Okay, we've got just 3 questions, then we'll wrap it up. One is from Natasha Gurung. She's asking, data have been provided about the rise in domestic violence during this pandemic. What are your views? I think you've already questioned, answered to this question. But the second question is, would you say that it is because of economic crisis or some sort of stress? What about the daily wage earners getting affected by this pandemic? I think ma'am wouldn't be in the position to answer the last question, because she didn't have much time and because of the technical issues as well. But I think definitely ma'am is in the position to give you the answer for the second question.
Yes, I think I've answered on domestic violence, but yeah, I mean, I won't say that it is only because of the economic crisis, because domestic violence is a reality that has been there during, before, and will continue after the post-pandemic period also, because like I mentioned of how it's a result of a particular gender order where we see or imagine these cases of gendered violence and understand and perceive it. But yeah, I will also say that the spike right now and the increase can be, it is also connected, not only, but it is definitely also connected to the rising economic crisis. And that is why there has been an increased spike in the number of cases that have been reported. And I hopefully in the days to come, more data or more statistics will be available to us to be able to, draw these interlinkages and come upon a more concrete analysis of this kind of an interconnection. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, Dipti ma'am, adding to what this Natasha Gurung had to, let me just mute it. There are just two questions. Adding to what Natasha Gurung had to ask, she states another question, and which is quite, interesting as a question because, feminism or the feminist perspective has been misinterpreted most of the time. So, I would question you the last question of hers: why the term feminist triggers aggressiveness in people's mindset? Because you've already talked about the father and all.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question because that's something that we have been witnessing. The minute you drop the F word, it's like you're seen as being, oh my God, you're a feminist and you're aggressive and you hate men and all of these typologies and generalizations. And I would also sort of I think it's also because, like I said, of the role that popular culture and social media that has been playing in shaping our understanding of feminism and what feminism has been reduced down to. And like I said in the beginning, of how questions of gender and feminism are not operating in isolation, but also how it has been working in it works in intersection with other identities and other developments at play. So how, like, seemingly what looks like, for instance, say a feminist ideology, or what looks like a feminist propaganda or a feminist statement is being picked up in bits and pieces, and by it's being introduced and accommodate it into existing structures which are already patriarchal, which are already misogynist, and which helps further them, which is again what we have to see in terms of the consumerism that is taking place, where popular media then has a very, very strong role to play in terms of how you see these identities are being passed on, and how, for instance, let's take an example of, for instance, like a popular brand, for instance, endorses a particular product and sells it in the name of feminism, where you see endless advertisements on popular media now which sort of talks about women's rights and which talks about presenting the popular progressive women, but it is closely intertwined to the capitalist development ideology that is in place, which in itself has been a source of creating so many new multiple challenges for women, right? So how it is perceived and how it's being reproduced, like I said in the beginning, when we talk about a new world order, or when we talk about producing a new narrative, so what you see is also like there's been an increased number of rise in terms of women's participation or women going out into the public spaces, right? So let me give you an example, and hopefully this will be able to sort of clarify what I'm trying to say. It's like, just because women are out there in the public spaces, or women have been in the forefront, first of all, we must we must first begin by challenging or reducing the idea of feminism equals to women completely. That's completely wrong, right? Which has been passed along very strongly. And feminism also does not equal to male bashing, right? Feminism is an ideology which takes into account multiple identities of oppression, and then it tries to imagine a world order where all of these exclusivities are taken into account, and you create a new narrative based on that, right? So let me give you an example of, for instance, you have many women's group who are out there in the public spaces, who have been part of political movements, or who have been part of political projects, or who are there working for women's rights. But what kind of a women's rights are they talking about? How are they then defining the role of women? Whether it is still structured or accommodated into existing power structures that has in the first place been products of the, like for instance in Darjeeling, when the political agitation was taking place, you've seen there is a huge presence of the women's group in the political spaces, right? But why has it not materialized into women emerging as decision makers? Secondly, whenever I start speaking about women's representation, then I'm told, like, of course we do have some political figures, like they name one or two characters, and there was this video that was being passed around during the elections of a popular political figure, a female, who then sent out a video message where she talked about, like women, the Nepali women in cities like Delhi, Bangalore, all of these places have to be careful about the kind of clothes they wear or their lifestyle, because it is our women indulge in these activities that they are getting harassed, or they are getting raped, or they are getting so in a sense saying that it is our women who are responsible for being treated in a particular manner. So that again produces a narrative where you are saying that you are producing a discourse on women's rights, but you are talking about reproducing the similar structure that in the first place has been oppressive to women, right? So when you question these terms, when you question and you look at these questions, it's important for us to understand where is it coming from, what is reproducing this kind of a discourse. And when you question that, that is where I believe that feminism comes into play, of how you then continue to question a particular power structure, and which is where feminism is being misinterpreted in the terms of how particular notions are then being picked up and passed upon as being feminist, right? So you might have a female ambassador who, on the one hand, promotes militarization, but on the other hand, goes on to talk about women's rights. So that is in contradiction to the whole idea of the gender justice or a gender equal society that you're talking about. And that is where I believe that these kind of misrepresentation and a constant reproduction by passing off popular media by these kind of so-called feminist discourses that has placed it in, like, in the popular imagination that feminists are generally aggressive. I have met a lot of like soft spoken feminists, or even feminism is a very broad category. Like you have so many different forms of feminism within the feminist category, right? So that is how I believe that popular media or popular culture or social media, the power that it has in shaping our perceptions of how we define particular identities or particular ideologies. And that's where feminism has been so strongly now being misinterpreted with this whole idea of feminists being aggressive people, which is completely not true, and which is just being constantly produced in the public spaces where our social media and popular culture have a very strong role to play in producing these kind of an understanding of what a feminist looks like, or what a feminist speaks like, or how a feminist looks like. So I hope that has sort of given you a brief gist in terms of what I've been trying to say, and maybe we can have a discussion on this later.
Thank you, ma'am. Considering the fact that we are running a bit out of time, there were a few questions, and I think, ma'am, what I've done with Mr. Prajanya Sen was that he will be definitely responding to the unheard questions, and I think the same procedure should be followed in case of Dipti ma'am's as well. But going through the questions, a few questions sound quite similar, but I think one question in fact stands out from the rest is stated by Themsorin, because she basically talks from the perspective of, in questions from the perspective of women, men. So her question is, what would be the role of the male counterparts, when it comes to responding to this phenomena? Because all this time we've been only talking from the perspective of the women, how they've been subjugated. But I think this question serves very much important for all the audience out here. Dipti ma'am?
Hello, am I audible? Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
So yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, and it's like, what are your thoughts faced by working women? What would the role of male counterpart? Like I said, this is like the pandemic has not discriminated against anyone on the basis, like, in terms of like, okay, this is just going to affect women more than men or all of that. But based on the particular histories that we have, that it is also important for us to recognize that you see, men and women have been impacted, and they will be impacted. And the more we go into these marginalities and peripheries of identities and regions, you will see that, so for instance, an upper class male member would be differently impacted than how a lower caste male member would be impacted by it, right? And again, if you go into further of these exclusions, you will see how then lower class working women would be impacted by these phenomena. So like I said also, and I would like to add to it, it's like, women as a group have been historically marginalized. This is something that we have to understand. So the impact that any kind of a development or any kind of natural disasters that affects us as human society, the gendered impact of it is definitely going to place more burden on women vis-a-vis the male counterpart. This is now again not to say that men would not be impacted by it. And this kind of a segregation, like I said, is in terms of the data and statistics of how what I've said, these are just broad theoretical generalizations and assumptions based on what we have seen in the past that has come about. Now, data and relevance and perceptions in terms of what the COVID has created is yet to be brought to the forefront, because this is an unprecedented economic or socio-economic crisis that we have witnessed, right? So, how it has affected these different segments is yet to be seen. Only time will tell, and only when we have reliable, factual data that would be brought from the grassroots, because now movement has been halted. This kind of a thing had never happened before. So, data and fieldwork in itself has been brought to a halt, right? So, all of our information is just based on a limited privileged pool. That's why initially I mentioned and emphasized that whatever I'm going to speak about is also from my position of privilege, where I've just had connections and conversations with my own friends and colleagues who've been in the same positionality to speak about it, right? But like the impact on the male members that you were talking about, they have also been definitely impacted by it. You can see a large number of, like in the Darjeeling Hills, migration mostly takes place towards like foreign countries for skilled and semi-skilled workers and laborers, right? A lot of them have reported and come back. The mental health impact of these individuals is yet to be recorded. The kind of then the mental health and then how it has affected their mental well-being and physical well-being is yet to be brought to the forefront. And again, then we have to bring in the nuances of these class realities that is going to bound to have an impact on these families. So that is also going to play a huge role in terms of how men and women are affected by it. So I can't give you concrete answers on it right now, but I do definitely believe that it's been the lowest of the lowest rungs of the strata that has been affected the worst by this crisis. I mean, the huge exodus of the migrant working class that was on the streets for so many months. In fact, if you go by a lot of data from the journalists who are reporting from the ground, not the television media, but the print media, you can find a lot of resources that a lot of number of deaths that took place of these migrant workers were not from the pandemic itself, but from hunger and starvation that took place because of that huge exodus that was forced upon the people, right? So these realities are yet to be brought to the forefront. So I would just like to emphasize on that when we speak of gender and feminism and these questions, it's also about talking about these realities and not just limiting it in terms to women as a essentialized category that we understand of. So yeah, I would like to, maybe I can deal with this question later on also in more detail through email. It's available, so I can be available on email also.
Thank you, Dipti ma'am, for the talk. And this is for the audience. Yes, thank you, Dipti ma'am, for the talk and trying to provide the answers to the audience. And this is for the audience as well. It seems like a lot of questions have been coming up, but keeping in mind the time factor and the technical issues that we are going through, I hope the audience will not mind, because our resource persons could not answer to all of your questions. But for the sake of it, we will definitely forward you the email links of a resource person. So all the queries which you've sent through the chat box will be forwarded to them, and you can actually have an interactive session with them, from your personal standpoint as well. So as we've approached to the end of today's session, I request Ms. Rachel Sittling, HOD from the Department of Sociology, for vote of thanks. Rachel, ma'am, are you there?
Ma'am, am I audible?
Yes. Yes, you're audible. Have you turned on your, could you please turn on your...
Yeah, it's turned on.
It's not, okay. It's not showing up. Right? Okay, ma'am.
Shall I continue?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So we have reached the end of the webinar today. And of course, I am here to deliver the vote of thanks. On behalf of the Departments of Political Science and Sociology, I would like to sincerely thank our Rector, Principal, Father Dr. George Tharatil, our Vice Principal from Art Stream, Father Dr. George Tampakatinal, our Vice Principal, Science Stream, Father Ajay Kurian, Dean of Arts, Mr. Peter Lepcha, and also our wonderful tech team, Mr. Dhiro Sir, Ms. Yadika Prasad, and Mr. Amit. Thank you for supporting us in organizing such a wonderful webinar. Thank you for this opportunity and this experience. I would also like to extend my gratitude to our honorable speakers, Mr. Parjanya Sen and Dr. Deepti Tamang. Thank you, sir, ma'am, for agreeing to share your time and thoughts with us. As the pandemic has affected each and every one of us in different ways, your words today have enabled us to gain better insights into sensitive but real and existing issues in our society. Thank you to all the participants today. We hope that this was a good experience for all of you. I thank all my faculty members from Salesian College, students from Salesian College, as well as faculty members and students from other various colleges who have given us your time and participated today for this webinar. Your participation has made this webinar a success today. I would also like to request all our participants to kindly join us again on 9 September for our second phase and final phase of our webinar series. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, ma'am, for the wonderful vote of thanks. As a reminder, before we log out, I would like to inform you all to kindly access your email, the email which has been sent to you from the college for the particular webinar. So all the details are there, and I request all of our participants to kindly fill in the feedback forms for today's session, and the same procedure shall be followed for the 9th as well. So thank you very much for being part of this webinar. And I thank all our participants, our respected fathers, our tech teams as well as the faculty members. Thank you very much. Looking forward to meeting you on the 9th as well. Thank you, Mr. Prajanya Sen, and thank you, Dipti ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Father George, Father Principal, are you there? Where is he? Has he left?
I think he's not there.
Oh, he has left. He has left.
Yeah. Okay, it's okay. It's okay then. Let's end for the day then. Now.
Yes, you. Some of them have not logged out yet. I need to remove them.
They are.